Okay, so we're going to get our meeting started. We are going to begin with our public comment section, and then we have a presentation from our co-chair, Angela De La Porta. She's going to lead us through an exercise, and we'll also have some more discussion from other working group members. So I know we got folks doing their homework in the lobby, which is great. You can kind of listen along while we do that. And then do we have, for those who would like to do public comment, we do have speaker cards, which are available at the table there. And then you can hand the card to Chitra, who is sitting here. We do also have a public comment section at the end. And so we will make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak either during this public comment or at the latter public comment. Chitra will be our timekeeper for those comments, and you have about 3 minutes. And then after public comment, I'm going to say a few remarks about the meeting that's happening right now, the City Council meeting, which is beginning and which scheduled around 8:45 is a section to begin about update on our housing work plan for the city. And so we can talk a little bit about that. So Chitra, can you first call the roll, and then can you please call the public speakers?
Roll call. Angela De La Porta. I think she, yeah. Here. Kristen Flynn. Terry Holzheimer, Gail Price, here. Heather Rosen, here. Lance Smith, Yunan Song, Tim Steele, here. Lakiba Pittman, here. C. Zhang, Alexander Liu, here. Keith Rechtel, Doria Suma, here. Waldemar Kamarski. We have a quorum now.
8 is what's required for a quorum of 14.
I understand that in our rules, which Chitra has looked up for us, which were published. When were those located, Chitra, if folks want to find them on our website?
Yes, it is mentioned in the first working group meeting under ground rules for the working group. There is a paragraph where the decision maker meeting can have reached a quorum if there are 7 people.
Okay, so is that compliant with the Brown Act, which we are? I mean, I didn't think this needed to be a Brown Acted group, but you did it. So I believe 8 is what is required as a quorum for a body of 14. I don't see how this group can be different.
I'm not familiar enough with the Brown Act to know that part backwards and forwards. We can perhaps have Chitra see if there is a attorney who can answer our question. I know that those who are here are probably in the City Council meeting right now, so that's a little bit of a challenge.
I haven't started it. I'd be happy to go ask.
Chitra, do you want to see if you can get a hold of one of the attorneys to answer this question? Okay. But again, it's stated in our rules, and so I think until we learn otherwise, which we'll look into, we're going to go ahead with the meeting. So I have right now 4 speaker cards, and I'm going to call the first speaker. And if you can, the podium is here. There's a microphone. Please turn on so the red light is on, and you'll have 3 minutes. The first speaker is Stephen Levy. If you push your button, then you can have your microphone be on, sir. Thank you.
Just like you said. I've lived and worked here for a little over 50 years, and I come tonight to ask you to go really big on housing for the North Ventura site. If any of you have had a chance to read Jonathan's work plan that he's going to present to the council tonight, he remarks on both how important and how precious this site is in terms of being the main opportunity site to meet our housing goals over the next decade. It's the largest site in our housing element, as you know, and your consultant has given you 3 very robust sets of alternatives to pick from. The second point in Jonathan's memo is that projects have to pencil out. That means whatever we want, your eventual North Ventura plan can't have retail that isn't feasible and may need to have some revenue-producing developments like at North Bayshore or in Valco or around Dearden Station. The third point, which he points out, is that for the next RENA and the next housing element, the regional goal is going to go way up. Not because we're growing more, but because HCD has added provisions to mitigate cost burden and overcrowding to build housing for the hundreds of thousands in the region of households who are challenged by insufficient supply and unaffordable prices. The fourth point is not so nice. HCD has made it clear that if a city violates its housing element, for example, by taking housing out or by making it infeasible, the city is inviting a lawsuit. HCD has started to sue cities. This is our opportunity to show that local control in Palo Alto, which I know is important to some of you, can really work, and this is the site to make it work. Please work with your consultant, pick one of those very big, robust housing alternatives that they've laid out for you. Thanks.
Next speaker, David Hirsch.
This fits in pretty well with the previous speaker. These are some considerations regarding the Perkins and Will schemes in a practical view. Is it reasonable to change the present land use patterns from office to residential as is proposed by Perkins and Will for the blocks adjacent to El Camino? Will the change create added value? If not, isn't this change an unlikely prospect? Why fly in the face of economic reality? Planning without a proper economic analysis is inadequate and misleading. The consultants propose new streets within the Fry's site. Will the city pay for the street construction and the new utilities and expensive proposition, or will that be the responsibility of the developers? Will that cost be prohibitive? Isn't it a better idea to try to maintain the existing street grid and design the new development within the superblock area? None of the Perkins and Will schemes consider this. Where is the parking for both the neighborhood community's use, the new residents, the office workers, or the retail employees? This is always a major planning determinant and cost factor and cannot be overlooked. If Fry's is reduced in size, what will the developers consider a fair exchange, since they already noted that rental of the Fry's building has significant value? Perhaps a new office building facing El Camino would be an incentive. They already own a section of El Camino property and have determined, I believe, that it is not feasible for housing. A significant benefit to this proposal, if accepted, that is this commercial building, would free up the eastern portion of the site for residential and retail uses. The Fry's lot, because it allows a greater housing density, changes the calculus to permit potentially successful marketable housing. This is because there can be an economy of scale and a significant cost construction saving. Another inducement for the developers to consider reduction of the Fry's structure. A further benefit to the neighborhood and future residents is their common use of the site as a superblock. The interior space can become a unique park-like courtyard, an extension of Bulware, including a landscape bike and pedestrian exclusive path to Ventura, from Ventura to Park Boulevard. Besides being a significant more economical, this idea, I believe this is more in the character of Palo Alto than the dense urban street images and multiple buildings on sites in the Perkins and Will schemes. I request that you ask your consultants to include this option in their analysis and for the committee to give it a place in your discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Next speaker, Kelsey Barnes.
Is that your phone?
Good evening. My name is Kelsey Baines. I am a resident of Palo Alto and want to thank the committee members for doing what I think is a pretty hard job of planning what I would encourage you to think of as a new neighborhood. And I came here today to try to urge thinking about this in a futuristic way, thinking about who, once this is finally built, which may take a decade if it goes the way of the SOFA plan, who is going to be living there and who is going to benefit from those plans. And as someone who is on the younger end of the spectrum for a Palo Alto resident, I will say that my peers struggle to live near Palo Alto, in the Bay Area at all. And we really need action on housing if we're going to be able to stay in the Bay Area and raise families here and be a part of this community and serve this community. So in that futuristic thinking, what I would encourage you to think about is prioritizing people over cars, prioritizing walkable spaces and dense spaces that will maximize the open spaces that we have available to us and make it feasible to build. I think the developer has already expressed, like, if this is going to be a RM30 project, they're not going to bother with it. So I would encourage you to think about, like, as you walk down Forest, look at some of those buildings that are beautiful in this walkable space, and that might serve as a really nice model. So like a 5 to 7 story building with less parking that is going to have access to more retail. That is what a lot of young people would like to see, and I think a lot of seniors who are looking to move into spaces where they're not going to need to rely on a car would also like to see. So yeah, just prioritizing dense, walkable areas, and also thinking about the financial feasibility of, is this even going to happen? Because a plan that isn't going to happen isn't a very useful plan. So thank you for all your work, and I hope we can move forward with a plan that is going to create a livable neighborhood for lots more Palo Altans in the future. Thanks.
Next speaker, Becky Sanders.
Good evening, working group plan members and city staff and consultants. I'm Becky Saunders. I live in Ventura. My daughter, Victoria, who is 28 years old and expecting her baby with her husband, Jeff, lives with me. And I would love to see housing that they could afford. They were renting a house, apartment in North San Jose for $3,500 a month. And I said, well, you can't save anything on that. Why don't you come home for a little bit? So I'm really excited about that. So I do want housing there. I was a little bit in shock and awe when the last I heard in the December staff report was about 356 units or whatever the comp plan called for. I may have my numbers wrong. And then I go in here, plans A, B, and C, and it's like, 900 units, 1,400 units, 1,700 units, 2,000 units. I'm like, wow. And who is going to live there? So one of the things that we are very interested in Ventura, I know, is below market rate housing. It has to pencil out for Sobrato. So is there any way that, and of course, they have us over a barrel. The, private business has the government over a barrel. So we can't do anything. Well, I'm not sure about that. Why don't we just buy the whole site and zone it for modest and below market rate housing for the people that really need it? I mean, that is way the heck out of the box. So, I want this to happen. Frankly, I think someone was saying low rise. I said, these are low rise, like a 4 or 5 story building is a low rise? That somebody has redefined low rise. Hello? But so anyway, I'm just letting you know that I'm not going for the smoke and mirrors. You can't call a 5 story building a low rise and, medium density and things like that. So I don't want to be a curmudgeon, but I just would like to put it out there that there's something a little bit disingenuous about today's 3 alternatives. They're very, very different from what I was expecting. And also, I just want to complain that I looked at them today after, my 3-day weekend. The report came out on Friday night. So I just want to register a complaint about that. But I know it's a hard job. It's not easy. You guys are doing a bang-up job. But, Becky's not happy. So thank you very much.
Our last speaker, Karen Holman.
It's become a bad habit coming to these meetings. So I looked at the models out here. Well, they're gone now. They're being taped out of here. Yeah. Oh, okay. There they are. There's a lot missing. As I've said before, it's like I was in the SOFA working group and co-chaired the second half of it. And there were building types there that were existing buildings that, were RM40. They were building types that, unlike much of what is on these plans, actually do build on the character of the area. It's one of the council goals for this area is to build on the human-scale urban design strategies and design guidelines that strengthen and support the neighborhood fabric. I don't see how this does it. I really don't see how it's responsive to the council goals. I was thinking about this today because also, like others, it was a holiday weekend, but I was thinking about, what's going to happen if a plan that's being sort of, I would say, encouraged by the staff and consultants, when that gets to the council, what's going to happen? And the council looks at the goals that they established and looks at this and goes, what happened? Do you want a plan that's going to result in some forward movement, or do you want a plan that's going to get like, holy good golly gee, when it gets to the council and the public at large sees this and the council's like reacting to it, and this is an election year. I just don't see how this is going to be a productive process if this continues along this path of super density. What's the density of some of what's being proposed? Our highest density is for RM40. I'm not saying that we need to be stuck with that. I agree with the previous speaker, though. I don't know anybody that thinks that low rise is 4 stories. I don't see that being anybody's picture of 4 stories. But what's the density of some of these buildings that are being proposed in such density? And what's the likelihood of redevelopment or conversion of use in this economy? Remember that economies change. There was a big uproar about, where Hyatt Ricky's Hotel was, and that's where, sorry to promote myself, that's where I came up with the terms like zone for what you want. If that isn't what you want there, don't zone for it. If you're going to zone for, I'm just going to make up something here, if you're going to zone for 8 stories, be careful because you just might get it. And then what is the community going to say? And how are we going to handle the infrastructure of schools and transit and all that sort of stuff? So, cautionary tale here. It's like, I've been around, I'm not ancient, but I've been around long enough that I've seen a lot of things happen that have not come to good end, either because they were referended or because there was a recall of council or something of that nature. And I think you're putting a really great burden forward to the council. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chitra. And so tonight, and I apologize, I have a little bit of a cough, so I have a cough drop right now, so apologies if my speech is not as clear as usual. Just want to thank all the working group members for being here, our consultant team for being here. Good to have everyone here, and also for the members of the public who are here to join us this evening. I want to speak at first to the city council meeting, just because there was some confusion, some questions about that, and then I'll speak to tonight's meeting here, what we're planning to do this evening. So right now, well, I shouldn't say right now, it's 6 o'clock right now. City council is having a meeting this evening. They normally meet on Mondays, but they rescheduled because of the holiday to Tuesday to today. Our meeting had been planned for quite some time, I think at least since late November, to meet on this day, on January 21st. And so one of the items that became part of their agenda is an update to the housing work plan. I believe last year in 2018, Jonathan Late, Director of the Planning and Development Services Department, presented a housing work plan to the City Council. And so this is kind of an update of that plan heading into 2020. There is a staff report. It's about 26 pages that you can read online, or there may be some copies, hard copies in the council chamber if you're interested. One section of that report does discuss the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan. I do have some copies of that one page, well, it's 2 pages, but it's one sheet. So I'll pass those out if working group members want to take one, and there'll be some extras to be on the document table over there. And so if you want to take one, you can take one and pass it on if you want. And really that just summarizes the NVCAP and kind of where the program is. And then there's about a slew of other items. You can see that's item number 1, and then there's many, many other items that are discussed in the housing work plan update. So the city council, I'm not one to say what they will or will not discuss, because the agenda item is an update and discussion of this work plan. And so they could have a far-ranging discussion, just covering all the topics that are included there. They could focus on a few. They could, talk about all of them. But what they're not really agendized to do and not planned to have happen is make any decisions about the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan. They're not going to be giving us, I don't think, any directives, although, again, I don't want to say what they can and cannot do. And so we wanted to continue with our meeting. They are slated for our meeting tonight to make sure that we kept steam. We have, as many of you know, not received the requested funds. We wanted to expand our scope of our work. It means we're a little bit more tight-belted than we might normally be, and so we're really trying to make sure we stay on schedule. Any slip of our schedule ends up could become highly likely more expense for our consultant staff. So we wanted to keep with tonight's meeting. That said, for those of you who really either want to go to the council meeting or watch it, they're scheduled to begin about 8:45, their discussion about the housing work plan. And so you could, after the conclusion of this meeting, go to listen. You could go home and then watch it on TV if you wanted to, so you know what's happening. So that is an option that will be available to you if you so choose. There's also the possibility they could begin earlier, and I'm sorry, I won't be able to double duty and kind of know what's going on there and in here. The item that does precede us is both a study session on wildfire mitigation, and then also, which is slated for an hour, and then also a discussion of the grade separation for the rail, which is scheduled to be about an hour and 45 minutes, I believe, discussion. So that could end early. Again, not taking bets on whether that's going to happen or not, but I don't think so, but just saying it could. All right, so you should have plenty of time to hear the housing update. Any questions about that? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so seeing no questions, I want to come back to tonight, what we're going to be doing. So we have a couple things tonight. One, we're going to start out with one of our co-chairs, Angela Delaporte, is going to help us with an activity that she has worked up and talk with myself and Gail about, just try to help us ground ourselves in the vision for what we're doing as we continue to go into the details of what we are wanting to do. And then we're going to toss it over to one of our working group members, Tim Steele. He's going to give us a little update on the Serato organization's plans for the Fry site. I know 340 Portage. And so I know that's something that's very much important to us as we're thinking about what we want the future to be, to kind of understand how the evolving present or the kind of near-term future is looking at least to the property owners. And then we're going to get into a presentation from Perkins & Will, including our wonderful economic consultant. Gail, you'll be very happy she's here. Sujata, who will help us to understand the financial feasibility of the different prototypes that she helped to develop that you see in the proposed plan. And then we'll have, of course, time for question and answer during that discussion, and then some more time for tabletop discussion. And I will say, one of the things that we want to know is, I think, 2 things. One, the iterative nature of this discussion. It's like a snowball we're building, right? So we're talking about last time circulation and what kind of uses did we want, and like how much open space we want. We're adding in some building designs. Where might those be? How could those uses kind of reflect this idea of the Portage kind of being a main street? And there are other things we need to layer on. We need to layer on, what does the school kind of attendance yield look like when we talk about the number of people? We need to kind of snowball all these things in. And that is to say, we have a conversation, we get more information, we make a decision, we come back and we add more. There's a whole layer of policies that would need to be in place to uphold whether it's parking or retail or other decisions that we're making. So we're continuing to add more to the plan, and so it's by no means finished. So there are lots of things missing, indeed, and that is by design because we're still building to it. And lastly, one of the things I think that we want to add is more voices from more people. It's great to have this dedicated working group. We want to get more voices from the neighborhood, and so we have scheduled on February 27th a community meeting to kind of try to get more people in ways and have different ways for people to interact. Some people like to talk, some people like to write, some people like to draw or use dots, whatever the way that they can do it. Our co-chairs have suggested a couple locations, and one that we're looking at is Gunn High School as a potential location. If you think that's not a great location, we have some others, but we're trying to get things that are a little bit closer to the neighborhood, that people have a neighborhood connection. And so that was a suggestion from our co-chairs, and we're pursuing that, but we're open to other locations if that's not feeling right. Please do let us know, but we want to hopefully also enlist your help if you're interested not only in letting your friends and neighbors know about it and coming, but if you're interested in facilitating or helping to lead a station, it would really be great to make it a team effort. Yes, which is a Thursday. I think we're 6 to 9, and we can talk about whether is 7 to 9. What's the right time frame for the public, and make sure that we also have enough time for setup and cleanup that evening. I don't know if Angela, you want to say anything about that location. I know that was something we talked about, or if others have comments or.
There's a great new building at Gunn High School with a beautiful, very large room, fully equipped for all the visual presentations we need to make, and lots of chairs and tables, and I think it would work really well for us.
Great. Thank you for suggesting it and helping us get that set up. Okay, so if there's any other questions or comments before we dig in. So Angela, I don't know if you want to come over here to run the slideshow, but I can put your slides up. I'm going to need to plug in. Sorry to disrupt our AV setup. It's a stubby little HDMI cable. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
In case this rings, I don't want to bother you.
I really appreciate having the time to do this because I want to lead a brief exercise on vision. I feel as if individually we've had a chance to express our visions or what we'd like to see at the NVCAP in the working group, but these have not coalesced into any kind of a cohesive vision, and that's what I'd like to start doing today. So thank you for indulging me with a brief exercise. To introduce it, I wanted to share with you some photos that I took in Santa Cruz in the fall of the tannery in Santa Cruz. It's a development in Santa Cruz, and I think it's a great example of how disparate groups can come together and create a development that really does show clear, strong, cohesive vision. So I'm going to go through it as quickly as possible, and then I'm going to ask the working group and anyone else who'd like to participate in a brief vision exercise. Thank you. Okay, so the tannery. It's so odd not to have it in front of me. It's okay. So on the campus, I guess you could call it, disparate groups got together, and I have all the information about the groups and how it worked, but I'm not going to go into all that information right now. But they did manage to build 100 live-work units for artists, and it's 100% affordable housing. There's a bike pedestrian path that runs between the housing and the San Lorenzo River. The bike path actually runs all the way to the beach, which is a couple of miles away, and through downtown and things like that. So it's beautiful. There's a lot of locally made art on the campus, and the art often references river themes. You can see the river on the right and lots of river animals and things like that in the art scattered throughout. The Arts Council of Santa Cruz County, that's one of the groups that came together to make it work, sponsors family-friendly arts festivals in the summer on the left and in the winter on the right. And they managed to save 5 historic buildings from this old tannery that existed for over 100 years in Santa Cruz. And this particular building that I took a picture of, it opens onto a courtyard, and inside there are dance classes. There were kids taking dance classes when I got there, several dance studios, and other space for classes, classrooms where they teach art and other things too, languages and things like that. And there's a cafe where the parents tend to hang out while they're waiting for their kids to finish their classes. It seems very busy. There are several little locally owned shops to the left there under the awning in another one of the historic buildings. The cafe is open every day and 3 evenings a week. It hosts regular trivia games and seems to be thriving. It's really focused, the whole development is focused on kids to a large degree. Student art is prominently displayed in the cafe, and obviously a lot of the classes are for kids and families, and there's kid events, kid-friendly, family-friendly events. The spaces and the classes and these events all seem to be focused on families and children. The playground is funded by a grant from a local family foundation. The art studios, there are 28 art studios. You don't have to read all that. They're managed by a national nonprofit called Art Space, and they function as galleries as well. And it is housed in yet another historic building with a monitor roof, you'll notice up there. And I'm not sure if this is an old building or not. It's in the place of an old building, but I'm not sure. And it was obviously built kind of in the style of a factory. And it's a theater where they were actually showing a film festival on disability when I visited. This image, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you can see on the upper left is what it looked like in 2001 when the tannery closed. And the buildings that are encircled in the red line, they were eliminated. And then the ones with the green dots on them are the historic ones that were kept. And then down on the bottom right, you'll see where the live-work units were built along the river. There's lots of historical information and illustrations and photographs throughout the historic buildings, even some tan bark you'll see on the bottom right, which they used to do the tanning of the leather. I just took a picture of a few of them. And there's a map that provides historical context. So it's not a perfect development, but I really thought that what it had was vision. And they have, in my view, they have managed to create a place that really welcomes and supports several different entities, I guess you could say. Artists, certainly. Creativity, families, learning, entrepreneurship for sure, locally owned businesses, and very, very definitely community building. And I feel that right now, our spaces, our words are empty. And that's what I would like to begin doing with this brief exercise today. Sorry? Oh, great. Okay, not yet. Whenever yes, thank you. Okay, here we go. All right. So before we do this little exercise, I'm going to ask if Gail would like to say a few words.
Well, other than thank you. Other than thank you for your presentation, and I think this is a valuable exercise to have. I look forward to hearing from people. My constant mantra is the issue of combining visioning and dreaming with economic feasibility. So thank you for moving us forward, and I look forward to it.
Okay, that's the button I wanted to press. Okay. Yes, I apologize. I am a former teacher. And so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask you to just indulge me. I believe that one can see better if one closes one's eyes. So if you feel comfortable, that is, to close your eyes, if you would close your eyes. I know. Well, I know teenagers are always nervous about this, let me tell you. But if you feel safe, yes, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and to picture what you might see as your own personal, most hopeful vision of what the NVCAP area could look and feel like. And I'm going to give you some little cues to help you envision this. But first, just allow your mind to see what your most hopeful vision might be. What does it look like? What does it feel like? And who's there? Imagine it on, say, a summer afternoon. I think that's the best, most hopeful moment one could choose. Maybe a summer afternoon around, say, 4 or 5 o'clock, okay? Imagine that you can see the details around you, and maybe you're in the center. Maybe you're not on the outskirts. Maybe you're in the center where things are most likely to happen. You see some people around you, I'm sure, but I wonder how crowded it is. See how crowded it is. What age groups are represented? What different types of people do you see? And what are they doing, these people? What kinds of establishments are they coming and going from? Just see it in your mind. Probably a lot of people are coming and going from school or work at that time of day. How are they moving around? What percentage of them are walking? Are some of them biking? Are some of them driving? What do you see? And what is in the surrounding area? Do you see trees, grass, offices, vegetable gardens? I don't know. I don't want to put too many ideas into your mind. But what do you see? Is there a playground? What does the creek look like? And how are people interacting with their environment? What do the streets and the pathways look like? Are they straight? Does it remind you of downtown San Francisco? Are they winding? Is it similar to California Avenue, kind of wide with trees? Does it remind you of a European town square or a mall? What does it remind you of? Are there lots of parked cars around? Are there parking lots? What are the buildings like? What do you see? How tall are these buildings in your ideal vision? What visible materials are involved? Are they mostly glass and metal? Are they wood or stucco? What are the sounds that you can see? So now that I've sort of pushed you to see a lot of details, I'd like you to kind of grab hold in your mind of the most important images in your vision. What stands out the most? And what words would you use to describe your vision? And while you're thinking about that, we're going to pass out something that you can write your vision onto. Pass those down there, and some down at your end, and here. And I'm going to ask you, you don't have to put your name on this. It's not going to be graded. But I would like to collect these from you so that I can see where we overlap. And I'd like you first to just write down a few words or phrases that encapsulate the most important images of your vision. What are the images? What are the most important images that came to you? And I left a big blank space at the top so that you could do that. And as an example, mine would be bikes and pedestrians, a wonderful mix of people. They're all sitting around eating and drinking and chatting and playing in a car-free area overlooking the naturalized creek, and the buildings are mostly 3 to 4 stories high. That's my vision, but it does not have to be yours, let me emphasize. What are the images, the strongest images in your vision? Oh, please, and we do have some more, if you'd like. Yeah. They're right here. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe the public would like to participate.
Yeah, some people got some. I think they're maybe going around.
So spend some time. I didn't mean to put you to sleep, although I did sometimes have that problem with my students. Oh, good. Oh, good. That's so good. Yeah, so spend a few minutes with this. I'm not going to rush people. Take a moment and describe the images that you saw. I think that's the first thing to do, is what are the images that are most important to you and your vision? Not yet. Don't do anything yet. Just Doria, if you want to do the thing on the back right now, you could. And if you want to start on the stars, you could. Yeah. Yeah. So on the back is like, well, I'll just I'll just explain it in a minute. Okay. Yeah. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to put down your pens, and you can always add to it later. Just finish up your sentence. And I'd love everybody to share, everybody in the working group, because we don't have that much time, to share one image that they'd love to see. And really, we may have very, very disparate images, and I think that's fine for right now. And then I'm just going to ask you to do 2 more little bits on this piece of paper. So let's see. Gail, would you be willing to go first? Okay. Just one image that you would love to see.
Okay. I'd like to see, I think I get this after 13 years. Okay. I'd like to see colorful and whimsical public art and lots of social gathering spaces for performing and visual arts and engagement.
Lakiba, would you be willing to go next?
Happy people, families, intergenerational and diverse.
Thank you. Keith, should we just go around this way?
I had green space with curved sidewalks and full of people socializing.
Mine was similar. I had green open park spaces with wooden areas and barbecue and playground areas.
Yeah, so in my mind, I actually have always thought of South Park in San Francisco, right in the middle of this neighborhood. It has the mix.
I wish I knew.
Yes.
I don't know the area. I thought at first you meant the cartoon.
No, I know.
So can you pick out one image?
If you can, it's a park south of the market, and I think it's an old historic park, but it has the mix of people of playgrounds, lunchtime office workers, and if you think of it's a contrast to all the busy, wide streets south of the market. And here you just go and you can just like relax. It's just, it's all trees, grass, food, old townhouses.
Lovely, thank you. Tim?
To be in the vernacular of your exercise, preservation of the existing building and leaving with legacy.
Ah. Okay.
Lots of good ideas. I also thought of a centralized park in addition to this stream. But I guess since people have said a lot of things, I'll say trees and skies, because people have covered a lot of
Lovely.
other stuff.
Yeah.
For me, it's a mix of uses, kind of like Alex was saying, mix of office, housing, some active retail in core locations, and also kind of the cars focus more on the exterior and having a walkable neighborhood in certain, critical components.
Thank you. I can really see that we do overlap in a lot of areas, which is very exciting and what I expected, to be honest. And now I'm going to just ask you to do the next 2 little bits on this piece of paper, but let me talk about them briefly first. The one underneath the space that you just wrote in is a kind of priorities exercise. I want to emphasize that none of these priorities is unimportant. I think they're all really important. We don't want to get rid of any of them. But I thought it would be very useful to know what are your most high priorities. And so if you can imagine that you have 7 star stickers and you get to put them next to whichever of these priorities you like the most, if you could just put 7 stars down next to whichever priorities you feel most are most important, and none of them are unimportant. That would be very helpful. In other words, you could put 3 stars next to one of these and then use your other 4 in other ways. 7 stars total. See, this is why. Yes, a budget of stars, 7 stars total. You can start over if you like. And then when you're done with that, your 7 stars on the back, if you, let's see, if we go back to this, if you want to fill in what you think are the most important words for us to keep in mind as we forge our map of where we want to go, where do we want to go? What is our destination? What are the key words that we want to keep in mind as we move ahead? The key ideas, the key concepts, the key images.
Just to, yes, and Angela, there are 15 items here. One is on the back, so just make sure you see, notice one got onto the back. And so if you do want to put your budget down, and if you do hand it in, we will tabulate it so we can share with everybody what they think, and we can even have our members who weren't able to come tonight. They won't have the benefit maybe of Angela's meditative talk. Maybe they can listen to the tape and do that. But they can also be able to participate as well.
And I'd really appreciate people to give them to me. That would be great. When you are done, if you could just pass them up to me, then you won't forget, or I won't forget at the end of the period. Yeah, I moved up here.
Do you want people to pass them in now? Can they wait till the end of the night? What's
can
best?
Wait till the end. Yes. Well,
So and I only say that because I know some people may have inspiration or something.
How are we going to remember? That's the thing. Chief, will you remember for us? To remind us
To collect these, yeah, we will.
Thank you.
I'll kind of set it up, and maybe if at the end we have some time, which we never do, but maybe we will. People can even share some of their priorities, or if they had words that they wanted to share. So we'll see what we can do, but no pressure to do that. Thank you very much, Anna. Let's give her a hand. Thank you for taking the time
No
to do
hands
that.
necessary.
And
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
just really appreciate your initiative on that regard. Okay, so if Tim, you want to take the seat where Angela was sitting next to me, just for electronic purposes, we are going to have a little update from Tim Steele, who represents the Sobrato organization, which owns 340 Portage. yourself too for those who may not know who you are, who are in the audience.
Good evening, Tim Steele. I'm with the Serato organization. I'm on the committee and have been quietly, most of the time, quietly listening. But I did notice first that there hasn't been a lot of description or discussion, or maybe even accidentally omitted from some of the information about the existing market and projects that are approved. And in the area of the planning, we have a project that is approved. It was approved about 2 years ago. It's been very difficult to currently justify building it economically. But we took 3.5 years to get it approved, and we spent about $4 million going through just that process of getting the city to tell us we can build a particular project. So we have every intention of respecting those entitlements and trying to find a way to build them. I will suggest that the rental market is not supportive economically, but possibly the ownership. So we are now exploring maybe partnering with a for-sale builder to build it, since the Seratos do not build for-sale housing of any kind. But I wanted to show you, here's the site plan. That's 2 different buildings with 2 different zonings. El Camino is on your far left. It's between Olive and Acacia. The frontage zoning, when we went through at the time, was CS, which allowed for 40% commercial, 60% residential. So in this particular site, we had Mike's Bikes, which also fell under the replacement retail ordinance. So it was about 8,000 square feet. So the first floor is dedicated, it's 19,000 square feet, and it's dedicated to commercial retail. It's affected by these height restrictions in the city, in that you can build 35 feet when you're within 150 feet of a single-family home, and then only once you're outside the 150 feet can you go to 50 feet. So in our case, kind of in that little elbow, inside elbow, next to the ramp, is single-family homes along Olive. So the proximity on the right-hand side of the El Camino building is within 150 feet, but as you get to the Acacia corner, we are allowed to go to 50 feet. So it makes for some challenges. There's a little bit of on-grade parking for the retail in the back, and then really the predominance of the parking to support that building is underground. So it's a lot. We had to build over two per unit. I believe we have about 99 parking stalls for 30 apartments and 20,000 square feet of retail in that building. Then when you get to the right-hand side, the lower right-hand side, that falls within the RM30 zoning. It was a little under half an acre, so it allows you to build 14 to 16 units of residential on that side. We have a sloping site from left to right in that building, and so the Planning Commission was very interested in not having any garage out of the ground, which meant the left-hand side of the building is totally underground parking, and the right-hand side is about 5 to 6 feet out of the ground and about 10 feet underground. So very expensive buildings, very restricted by the height and the proximity, and it essentially made this product very economically challenged. We did get it approved. We have had an extension, and we are trying to find a partner. We have 3 images we could show real quick for character. So I don't often get an assistant. This is great. I like this.
You'll see how helpful I am.
I'm not grading you. I just like having an assistant. So this is the 2-story building that I was talking about which is in the RM30. And this again is I'm coming down Acacia. I've just passed the CS. I'm looking at the end, the northern end, or the El Camino end of the Acacia building. It's 2-story. These actually are designed as townhomes, and if you ever want to know why, I can explain the details that at the time were really being driven by how the zoning was written. This is El Camino frontage in the CS building. You can see there's retail on the first floor, and we're on the Acacia Inn, so the building's actually 3 stories, and not in this view is it when it drops down to 2 stories. So that's a better view of the whole El Camino. This is the far left-hand olive end. You can see that we have 2-story residential over the retail, and then it pops up to 3-story. All of the 3 stories, to stay within the FAR, which is floor area ratio requirements, there is no corridor on the 3rd floor. It's townhome units, so it has an internal stair. So it's leasable space versus wasted space for a corridor. And it was a creative way to try to maximize the unit count on the site. It's a sloping site from left to right, so as you go towards the right, the retail is a little below the sidewalk, and it's at grade on the left-hand side. So that's, I think, the last image of that. Yeah. So the next image, if you could, is the...
Just a question on the El Camino
Sure, anything.
frontage. You have commercial retail first floor, and the stories above are what? Residential?
Residential. There's 30 apartments in this building.
Facing El Camino.
All of those units above the first floor are residential units, 30 of them in that building and 14 in the RM30 building.
Any other questions? So we're going to go to another, if I can find the mouse, another set of images. You want to go to this one, Fry site, or?
Yes, the Fry site, please. Second picture. Everybody knows this one.
Familiar place.
No, next one. Can we just do that? Okay, so this is meant to give you a sense of how the current main building that we talk about, Fry's all the time, is currently used. It's a little over 220-ish thousand square feet, depending on who you ask and what document you're looking at. And there's a lot of very old documents that are hard to add up to the same number. But the building itself is about 220, roughly, the main building. The small building in the bottom left-hand corner, the historic report suggested has potential for historic significance. And then the 2 areas in the main building that have a hash mark is the areas the historic report had pointed to. Fry's space, they're now out of the space, but the Fry space is kind of the middle of the barbell, if you will. And you can see the long bar sits there. It's about just under 90,000 square feet, plus or minus. Documents don't support a very good number that way, credible number. And then the 2 ends of the barbells, including the left-hand piece that's marked as historic, are currently leased out to office and R&D types of tenants. And I wanted to show this because the planning process that we've been going through when we started it was supposed to be roughly completed with the termination, expiration of the Fry's lease. Obviously, we're nowhere near being in a position to make a recommendation to council on what our plans are, but I'm faced now with the middle of that barbell essentially vacant and with no rent, no economics, and so forth. So I wanted to show you the scale of it. I wanted to show you how it's located. And with that, I have to suggest that we've been scouring the zoning to understand and appreciate the intent of the existing zoning that was made permanent in 2006, and how we go about addressing having the larger portion of our building empty today, and be respectful of a lot of the things that we've talked about in this venue, and which I value, all of them. But at the same time, there are challenges to things being economically feasible that tie back to, for those that were here earlier this month, to a simple economics 101 exercise that we did in this meeting. And with that, I wanted to lead into, and please forgive me if I offend or make anybody mad, but I do want to tell you that we have a retail tenant that's been very insistent on being considered to go in a portion of the Fry's vacant space. And I don't think it would be fair to this group for you to hear it on the street without having an opportunity to hear it from me first and from staff and ask any questions as we look and explore the possibility of replacing retail with retail. We were approached by what I would consider a very similar use to CVS in size and scale and product, or Walgreens for that matter, a neighborhood serving small format Target. And I know some people will bristle at the word, but we've done a lot of research and we've looked at it very closely, and we can pull up the slide deck. And in the context of the location, we're very surprised that any retail would be interested in going into a mid-block type of space. And we didn't want to waste any time, and we actually seriously turned them away about 2 to 3 months ago. And they came back, and they essentially parked on our front door and said, we're not leaving, because we think we have a product that would work, and our product is something we can actually craft to represent services and uses and products that target the needs and desires of the community and the neighborhood. I think it hits on a lot of things that I've heard in this room, and one thing I haven't heard at this table, other than this exercise today, is a consensus on 1 or 2 items as being the most important pieces. So we struggle with trying to, okay, what could go in there? What could we do with a property today that would capture as many of those in some respect and not disregard them? And so I want to walk you through first a slide deck that Target shared with us that has some examples of a small format and where they're at. They go into historic buildings. They're as small as 10 and 12,000 square feet and as large as I think 30 and 35 in these examples. The closest one is at Main Street in Cupertino, which is a recent project on Stevens Creek. And I believe they're about 12,000 square feet. So if someone wanted to run down the street and see what a small format, they have a pharmacy in it, they have some grab and go, they have some household goods that you might need on a short notice. I got to grab something, I'm out of toilet paper, whatever it is. My wife does that, so I don't go shopping for that stuff. So I won't try to suggest, but if you'll bear with me, I want to walk you through this so you can at least appreciate it. And then I'll stop there and I'm going to jump to examples. So Berkeley, this is kind of a traditional, but it's an urban building. They have some outside signage, which is not consistent with all these pictures. This went into a building, 14,000 square feet, University of Minnesota, Maryland and Minnesota. You can see they have a sign on this one, brand new first floor space, but it's small. Penn State on campus. This one I thought was interesting. This is in Boston University. They have a very strict design guideline there to be considerate to the historic nature of the community, the neighborhood stuff. You notice it's kind of a 2-story building inside, but the outside reads as a more colonial, historic kind of nature to it. And to me, this is really important because this is a company, a very large company all over the country that is finding ways to blend in with each community differently. This is interesting because this kind of lends itself internally to what we have in a lot of ways with where they went into an existing historic warehouse building and celebrated the timbers, celebrated that industrial look on the inside. You can see the outside, they did get allowed to have some signage, but the building itself is generally intact. San Francisco, there is no exterior signage. There is no exterior canopy. There is no exterior red labeling or anything. The ability for the space to fit in and identify its nature. This is 18,000 square feet, 19,000 square feet. That's a little glary for me, but bigger red signs. But that was back east, so. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I wanted to park on the last slide. There. This is the part I was talking about where they are very interested and open to looking at the kinds of services and products they have. And their stores don't have an identical mix of these, a small format. They kind of try to craft it and cater it in a way that provides the services the community might be interested in. So with that, I'll stop there. I have lots of notes, but I'm going to respect Rachel's time limit and allow you to, any
Appreciate
questions or
that.
comments.
So we'll
or
have
thoughts.
questions, and just to kind of put forward, I think Tim's hoping, as you said, to share with you what his organization is thinking, so you hear it here first, and any feedback that you have, any proposals for this, and possibly if there's additional requests to be part of this proposal would, depending, with just this, again, if they wanted to just replace with retail, that's a retail space that exists, and so could, put forward an application to the city for that, and would not want to have the working group not be aware of that and be able to know about it. And if there were any other applications for uses in the building, those would be also subject to submitting the application to the city for changes within the building. So we do have some time for questions. We'll try to do between now and 7 o'clock, so it's like 8 minutes, and see how much we can get, or 7 minutes. So Doria and then Angela. Or comments too, I think. Doria, please turn your microphone on.
Thank you for sharing that with us. How big a store did they want there? I mean, how much of the Fry's location?
The fry space is roughly 90. We're looking at how the historic pieces
Yeah.
and how the historic piece would work. I think that would be ideally where we would put them. The clear height in there, the kind of the inside experience in that space is great. It's really has a lot of potential. So that itself, those two bays, is about 18, and then the two adjacent bays, so probably 30-ish, 28 to 35 once we get it all measured out and figured out.
So that would be a repurposing and renovation of the historic building.
It would give us the opportunity to, rather than chop it up, I want that piece to be one piece. Yes.
Okay.
So did you just say that it would be about 30,000 that they would want this? It's, okay, yeah, out of the 90.
Right.
Roughly. But actually, my real question, though, was going back to the Mike's Bikes development. Oh. Yeah. No, that's okay. Yeah, so Tim said roughly 30. In answer to my question. But my real question is about the Mike's Bikes development. You said something about how the city didn't want underground parking on the smaller townhouse development off of El Camino, and I'm curious why and what that's about.
I'm sorry, I've said it wrong.
Oh.
They didn't want the garage to be out of the ground. We were trying to, right, so they pushed the whole garage into it. Okay. Even though I had height allowed under the 35 feet, that building's only about 25 feet.
Oh,
because they pushed the garage into
the garage is
which
partly
made it
underground. Or,
very expensive.
I see.
Yeah. Right. You did that.
Tim, the ARB gave you glowing reviews for that building.
Thank you.
As I recall.
Yes.
And I just want to say, I actually think that that particular project is very inefficient, and I think that's part of your problem. The single-loaded corridor, right? And it is that 150 foot.
The 150
feet. And the planning department has made numerous changes to the zoning code over the last year, and I know you're already approved. That doesn't help you.
We spent 3.5 years getting it approved and a lot of money. We don't want to open that can up and not end up with something as good or better.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah.
But I just want to put that out there, that the city is trying to make it more feasible on other projects.
I've talked with John fairly often about some of the challenges. One of the things that made it very efficient, other than the height, was there was a competition between the FAR limit and the unit count limit. And they aren't mutually exclusive. If you hit one, then you can't go to the other. And so part of our challenge is rental is on FAR. Unit count is less as important. So when that stopped us, as an example, a corridor, you don't get rent for. So when we had a double-loaded corridor, we had a lot of wasted space you can't get rent for that was counted against our FAR. So not always logical, but that's the rules we had to play with.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to share about the building or your plans for the rest of it, or you want to just let people know about the target and if people should contact you with feedback, or what kind of you're wanting folks to know, go away with tonight from.
I'd love to hear, I would imagine I'll get more offline, which I welcome and appreciate your call. I'm happy to talk about the whole idea, the challenges that we have with where to go next, and with the idea that we're not really interested in tearing it down and building housing today at any density. It doesn't make economic sense, as we got a direct experience from. But I welcome you to call me if you want to, or send me an email. Happy to talk about it. The remaining space is a challenge for us because of the way the zoning was written. We are talking with staff. We are talking internally about what would happen in the remaining space and how we want to approach that. So, thank you, Rachel.
I guess, Gil.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about we used to call it Target. Okay. And that is, have they conducted a market study or is it's too premature to suggest that this location would be economically viable for them? And some of the examples you gave are quasi-comparable to the Palo Alto experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I just was curious about
Well, they
how
have,
far down this road are they in their thinking?
they're based out of Minnesota, and the head of the real estate department in Minnesota, when he came back to insist that they are interested and parked on our front door, said he will fly out anybody in his company and meet with anybody here to express how interested they are in being here. The first time we kicked them to the curb and said, go away, they didn't do it nicely, and then they had the head of real estate call and say, no, we want to be there. I would presume for them to take that position, they've done some market research saying that this is some way, and it's not your ideal location on El Camino or another main street. So for them to think that this is something they can be successful at, I'm giving them a lot of credit.
And the miniaturizing of their signage is typical for like McDonald's as well. You know, there are some communities where they make the arch very small, so I guess they're trying to kind of do the same thing. But thank you. I've never heard of these, the small format for this particular store.
Thank you, Tim, for sharing that. And again, folks, please do give him feedback. And I'd love to also know, planning would also love to know your thoughts on that proposal as well. So imagine that you had a client who you were working with for a long time, and they worked you, hours and hours to get a presentation ready, and they told you you're going to have 2.5 hours to present it to a group, and then the day before or on the day of the presentation, it became an hour and a half. So that's what Perkins and Will is dealing with. So thank you guys for tolerating us. And so we're really lucky to have them here with their consultant sub from Strategic Economics as well to talk about and kind of further iteration of our 3 plan alternatives. And just to say we did, I think, contribute time to the visioning exercise and to Tim's presentation, which I think are well worth it and helping for this event. But just to say they're not going to rush, because I told them not to rush. We may have to make sure that we have more time for discussion at a later time. There's no way, I think, in the time we have this evening, we're going to have as robust of a discussion as we had wanted to have. And so hopefully we can all just roll with that and roll with the changes as well as Perkins and Will are going to. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Annie and Rachel and Sujata. And there is going to be a couple times where they're going to pause for questions. And so if you can hold your questions until then, unless you're totally confused about what they're saying, that will help us kind of get some information out. And then we can pause at those times and have some questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks for those presentations. We aren't going to rush, but there is a lot of information to get through. So, yeah, there'll be one place where we stop for questions in the presentation. So we won't go into a lot of detail about last working group, but it was really great. We got a lot of feedback, and there are very thorough notes available online. Really, every comment was transcribed nearly, so take a look. And the topics that we covered: circulation, ground floor use and program, housing typologies, district character, and open space. Information on all of those topics. One thing we wanted to bring attention to were kind of four topics that came up that you'll see apply across all alternatives, and these are things that we've carried forward from last working group meeting to today. So one of those was interest in adding Cloudera to all of the alternatives as sort of something that wasn't at odds with the rest of the development. The next comment was incorporating Palo Alto multifamily examples. So we've done that, and that's also what the homework assignment was about. So thanks so much for your comments. Also, including memorable open space. We really made an effort to pay attention to how open space is working in all of these alternatives and considering different kinds of open space based on some of the conversation we've had. There was also interest in senior housing. We just wanted to call out that any of these alternatives could accommodate senior housing. The next part of the presentation, we'll be talking about the building typologies that we worked closely with Sujata with. And so she's actually going to begin with a little bit of information on the economics of housing, specifically with respect to these building typologies.
Good evening. I'm Sujata Srivastava from Strategic Economics. And we have been hearing from staff and other consultants about some of the questions that have come up from the working group. And one of the questions was really about how is affordable housing funded? What are the major sources and how does that get built? So I really wanted to put them into two different buckets, and that's partly because of where those subsidies exist. So for extremely low, very low and low income housing, which is 80% and below area median income, there are existing sources of subsidy. The major one is something called the low-income housing tax credits, which have been in existence and are kind of the primary tool for getting lower-income housing built. That typically tends to target very low and low-income housing and below. There are county funding sources as well. Many of you may remember the voter measure, Measure A, which provides a lot of new funds for homelessness and for extremely low-income households. There's a little bit for home ownership as well, but it's a very small amount. Those sources are very competitive and need to be combined with other sources to really make that work. There are some new state funding sources. There's been a lot of news about some of those, and most of those are also targeting very low income and homelessness. So the city has some existing revenues, mostly through its housing impact fee and in lieu fee program, and that can help to augment some of these other county, state, and federal sources. As you know, many of those sources have been shrinking at the federal level, and so a lot of cities are really trying to figure out how do they backfill that, given the decline in federal cooperation for that and kind of the trickling in of the state funding, which is still taking some time to really hit communities. And at the same time, and I'll talk about this soon, like the funding gap is growing. So what households can afford and what it costs to build a housing unit in California and especially in Silicon Valley. For moderate and middle income housing, there really aren't any existing sources of subsidy. So we really rely on the private sector to help us get there, primarily through inclusionary zoning. And sometimes, in some cases, you can build more affordably by doing more compact units that are more efficient, and that can kind of lower the cost and make it more accessible for middle-income households. And in some cases, maybe moderate-income households, although that's hard to do here in the Bay Area. So just to kind of run you through some numbers of what it costs to build a rental unit right now, these are sort of preliminary estimates from some initial analysis that we've done and from work that we've been doing in the region. It typically is about $700,000 to $800,000 per unit to build a rental unit. And that is combining land costs, construction costs, soft costs,
and some amount of developer profit. And when you compare that to what the value is of what these different income categories can afford, you can see that there's a significant gap. The gap is a little bit smaller for moderate income households than it is for low and very low income. Similarly, for ownership
can you
units.
back up just 1 second, just so I can make sure folks see that slide? So the bottom is the total cost, market value, and you can see the gaps is that the missing part of the bar. So folks can really see the drastic difference from the top to the bottom of that chart. Thanks.
Right, and so actually what I'm showing here is really about the value of, what you would be able to get through rental revenues for a market rate unit, and then what you could actually charge a lower income household based on current regulations, so that it is affordable for those income categories. On the ownership side, what we're showing here is, it may cost somewhere between $765,000 per unit to $980,000 per unit for an ownership unit to build it. And then the sales price of a townhouse in Palo Alto right now is somewhere in the range of $1.4 million if it's a brand new townhouse, or $1.15 for a condo. So that's those darker bars. That's what you could potentially charge. So you can see that there's a little bit more of a margin there between the market values and what it might cost to build. The cost to build can really vary a lot, so just want to also provide the caveat that it really does depend on what kind of densities you can achieve on a site, what the property owner is willing to sell the land for, what kind of unit you build, and I think Tim touched on some of those kinds of issues earlier. However, what a moderate income household can afford is significantly lower than that, as you can see in this chart. So there's this gap, and when we ask developers to provide BMR units, they still have to build that unit at cost, and then they're selling it or renting it at below market rate value. So that kind of changes the equation in terms of what it looks like for a developer to be able to do that and how they make that work and how that pencils. Really depends on what you can do and how much is asked of a developer in terms of their BMR requirements. So when we were working with Perkins & Will on the ownership typologies, we looked at really developing some that were economically feasible and found that ownership projects were more likely to be able to provide community benefits, including the below market rate units and park revenues. However, it really depended on kind of what you assume about the density. So if you have somewhat more compact units, in a condo building where you're doing a higher cost construction type, then you're able to deliver more community benefits. Townhomes also perform pretty well. Can you go over this is a per unit? Yes. So, yeah. So the top line is the sales price, and then we kind of estimated whether or not it would be financially feasible based on some analysis, and then the community benefits line shows how much under current regulations would that development have to provide in terms of below market rate units. So right now the city of Palo Alto has a 15% inclusion area requirement, so 15% of the units need to be affordable to moderate income units in an ownership project, and then we looked at whether or not affordable housing in lieu fee revenues would be generated. Because they're providing the units on site, then they wouldn't have to pay the fees. And then we looked at park fee revenues, and that's based on the whole project. So if for that particular prototype that they'll be discussing later, that's generally what we think they'd be able to deliver in terms of revenues to help fund new parks.
To make the connection clear in case it isn't, this is showing the 5 prototypes that are the yellowish colored blocks, the townhome prototype and the low-rise and low-rise condo block kind of per those projects. So it's $147,000 in park revenue from that townhome scale development, correct? That prototype.
That's right.
Great. Any questions about this so far?
What are your assumptions on number of units? I guess I'm missing that.
I think that might be in the prototype section, which we will get to, each prototype. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're trying to front load the feasibility discussion, but we're missing a little, but we'll complete the picture in a minute.
Okay. A few questions, just to make sure when people understanding what we're, so that they can build, right, to what you're heading up to.
So really quick question on development cost. When you say 765K to 980K, does that include land costs?
It does.
It does.
And we were assuming somewhere in the range of $10 to $15 million per acre for land costs in this market. Of course, that can vary significantly depending on specific sites.
Great. Angela?
Yeah, just making sure I'm following. Are you saying that it's not feasible at all to build ownership units for moderate income?
So this is looking at a market rate project that has 15% of its units for below market rate. So it is feasible to be able to do the 15% inclusionary requirement, as is the current policy.
Okay, and so below market rate is not just the extremely low, very low, and low. It's also moderate and middle. So that's also BMR. It's all of those that you showed us were BMR.
So the city's current policy for ownership units is that 15% of them need to be affordable to moderate income households. So that's kind of what we modeled.
Okay,
Would this
now
be
I understand
feasible
that.
under current policy? And the answer was yes.
Great, thank you. All right, continue, Sujata. Thank you for. Did you have some, Jordan?
Okay. On the rental typologies, I think it's important to say right up front, for the rental, we assumed current policy, which is that rental developments pay an impact fee rather than providing units on site. So we looked at the feasibility of these different prototypes. All of the prototypes are assuming fairly compact units and really low parking requirements of 1 per unit. There is a lot of, these are fairly high density as well, and we'll describe them in a minute in terms of the efficiency of what's in those buildings. So this describes that most of these prototypes are feasible. The exception is the mid-rise, which is 85 feet, 85 foot with retail on the ground floor. It has a more significant increment of retail, and we found that the cost to build the retail wasn't really being offset by the revenues that could be generated from the retail. And the mid-rise without the retail was financially feasible. And then on the community benefits line, you can see how many below market rate units are provided on site. That's 0 because we're sort of assuming that they would pay the in lieu fees rather than providing units on site. And that shows that for the low-rise Greenway, you could get something between we could get something close to 1.27 million in lieu fee revenues. And I realized that it would be more helpful to see this in millions rather than thousands. And then the park fee revenues are also scaling up as you add more units, and you can contribute a little bit more per the requirements, current requirements. Now, one of the things that's important.
Can I just pause, Dr. I just want to tie in because we had a talk a few weeks ago from an affordable housing developer. So I want to tie in kind of what we heard from Diane from Palo Alto Housing. And so that is kind of, again, looking at the below market rate in this one, as Sujata said, if we kept with current city policy where those folks pay a fee that they're paying to the city, and that would go to projects like the ones that Palo Alto Housing works on. So the city's, I think, contributing $20 million to the project that they currently have, Wilton Court, and so that's funding that comes from projects that then goes to 100% affordable housing buildings. So instead of the below market inclusionary, what's included in the market rate building, this might go to Palo Alto Housing or others who apply and build 100% affordable buildings. Angela, and then Doria.
And could those in lieu fees go to helping a family afford to live in the actual buildings that you're talking about right here? In other words, could they just go directly to supporting some units?
We could probably think about ways to do something where it's staying within the project area. The way it's currently set up, we would need a different model of how the fees would be used. The other option would be we could develop a program similar to how Palo Alto has a program for having the units on site. We could develop something similar for rental. So that's just, again, a current policy gap we have that we could close. But again, they're using the current policy as their assumptions and would need to change it to adjust. Doria?
So my understanding was that for sale units, a developer, there's 15% inclusionary, and you could choose to build it on site or pay in lieu fees. There's no in lieu fee for rentals because they're not required.
It's a housing impact fee.
Well, there's housing
Impact
impact
fee.
fees, but it's not.
Sorry, I shouldn't have called it in lieu
I
fee.
mean,
I'm
there's
sorry.
there's impact fees for all types of building, but there isn't an in lieu fee.
I misspoke. You're right. It's a housing impact fee. I'm sorry
So, and
to
I
say
think
that.
there's other impact fees for other types
Oh,
of buildings too.
absolutely.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, okay, I just want
Yes,
to make sure
yes.
everyone knew
Sorry,
that.
and thank you for correcting me.
No,
That's good. It's good to keep it clear because there's a lot of terminology out there.
Okay, so, and I think I just wanted to note that, you know, like what Rachel was just saying, you could have a policy where you require the units on site, but there's less of a margin with rental developments to be able to do that in terms of feasibility, because the market rate prices the feasibility challenges are such that the construction costs for these kinds of projects are high enough that there's not a huge gap between what you can charge for market rate units and how much is left over in terms of revenues for you to then be able to subsidize a lot of units. There are certain policies that could be put into place to help create some of those incentives and make it more feasible. But we found all throughout the Silicon Valley that it's become more challenging for rental housing to pencil with those types of requirements.
And therefore, it is largely true that nonprofit developers for affordable housing prefer the fee versus versus building on site, because there's more flexibility. The city has more flexibility than how to use those funds.
I think the advantage is that you can then leverage other sources of subsidy. So if the city is able to provide a funding source, it allows an affordable housing developer to be more competitive when they're getting sources from the county and the state, because they have that local funding source that is something they can count on that's not competitive. So that's really the advantage, whether it's securing a site that is city-owned or securing the city funds up front. Really helps you put the deal together more efficiently. And then these are kind of just some explanations of some of the underlying figures. So, you know, we wanted to show kind of what the components of cost are in a typical market rate rental project. This is a 4-story low-rise. Pardon the language. So the hard construction costs are by far the biggest cost. That's, you know, the cost of labor and materials to build the building. Soft costs are the next largest category. Then you have land costs, and these again are per unit costs. And then you have profit and return. Now, here we're assuming something in the range of 15 to 18% return on cost. I think that it can really depend a lot on who the investors and developers are, but we think that under current market conditions, that's a pretty conservative estimate. These per unit? These are per unit.
Can I just throw out one other thing? So one thing to keep in mind for land costs, I think it's like the Santa Cruz Tannery was a good example. It's like if it's a warehouse, an empty piece of land, it's different than if you're talking about an occupied piece of property that you're going to tear down and build something on.
Right. Right. And if you have a revenue generating use that's already, you know, generating some revenues to that landowner, then they may have higher expectations for what they need in order to be able to do something else.
I think I just realized why my project's not penciling, because I couldn't get away with paying $95,000 in land cost per unit. It'd be more in line with your $10 million number. It's going to be $200,000 or more per unit. The construction cost is not going to change just because the land costs change. So I would suggest we're not getting 117 in profit either. Not on rental.
So I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the profit counts as part of the cost?
Well, I mean, I think the theory here is that if you're not able to have a profit, then a market rate developer isn't going to pursue the project. So we could remove that, but you would still kind of consider that as part of the overall development costs and what it takes to make a project get built.
And then why is it 15 to 18% profit rather than like a, I don't know, a 2% profit that you'd expect from your savings account or something, or wish that you could get from your savings account? Why is it so high?
Well, the risk is a big part of it. So every development project has a lot of risk attached to it. The other issue with when you're thinking about profit in this scenario, it's actually not just about the developer, it's actually about the group of investors. So most projects are leveraging investments from perhaps a pension fund or some other Wall Street investor. So that's really where the money's coming from. And if you have your money in a pension fund, that pension fund has to meet a certain threshold for what their investors are going to get, right? When I say 15 to 18%, it's 15 to 18% of development costs. So it's not a return, it's not a yield on cost metric. It's a different metric. But you need to be able to generate enough return so that you are competitive enough so that you can attract those types of capital. And I think that's really the key issue, is that in today's market, if you're not able to generate enough return, people will put their money somewhere else. They're not going to put it into real estate.
If I might just add to that, one of the reasons that the investors are looking at this is it's the security for the money they put in. So if they had to foreclose on the property and take it back, if they're foreclosing, then presumably the owner couldn't make it work. They need enough of a margin to know they have enough security to lend you the money. If they're going to just do it for even, they're not going to do it any more than anyone else, because it is security.
And also, but this, as Tim just explained to me, is a static moment, a snapshot of the picture. So it doesn't represent years of profit if someone was to keep, if the same owner was to keep the building. So that's just like if they finish the building at these costs and they sold it right away. So I just wanted.
Thank you. That's a really helpful comment, because it is a static. It's one moment in time, just to be able to kind of paint a picture. For most apartment uses, that's not really the way you'd look at it. You'd look at it as a longer term investment. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to show kind of one of the conversations that's been happening is how do rental apartments compare to office in terms of overall feasibility? Now, this is kind of comparing to the best extent possible. We are comparing apples to oranges, but we tried to make them apples to apples as much as possible. So we wanted to show kind of the total development costs of a rental apartment versus an office are somewhat similar. Office is a little bit more expensive. That's partly because we're assuming that office would have a higher parking standard than residential. But it's also a little bit about the construction requirements and the tenant improvements that are required in a premium Class A office. The market values are very high for office right now. If you're assuming really top rents, that's a big assumption. The rents have a lot to do with what type of tenant you're able to attract. So if we're thinking of small medical offices, you're not going to get this type of value. And then I showed kind of what the value would be if you also added those below market rate units and created kind of an average value per square foot. Once you kind of add in those below market rate units at 15, let's say you had 15% below market rate units in a rental project, that kind of brings down your average value per square foot, because you can't charge as much as the market rate on the residential.
Whereas, just to clarify, so it's $1,005, and then it would be brought down to $547 per square foot.
For a low income, and then $381 for a very low income unit.
And is that for that unit, or is that saying the average of all the units in that development go down to $547?
It's for that unit,
Okay,
and then that last
BMR
line,
unit.
the average value is for all of the units. So it brings you down to $928. So it's just a way of showing that there's a discount in the revenues that you're able to bring in if you have those BMR units on your site, but your costs are the same because you're still having to build those units. So the net value then becomes negative for a rental apartment when you have those inclusionary requirements on site. Whereas for office, you might still have some value left. And so the point is that in many communities, you're seeing strategies where the office is helping to offset some of the the burden that is being carried from the residential.
I have one question. What do you mean by net value? How is that different than just?
It's just the cost minus the value. I'm sorry, the value minus the costs. It's the balance.
Okay, so
So
once
it's
again,
that-
this is a static graph. It's a moment in time. Because, I mean,
Right.
we're hearing $1,000, almost $1,000 a square foot for office rental in Palo Alto. So it's like.
This is
For office?
It's showing that.
So yeah, for office, we have, so
Showing
let me just go
1,224.
through line by line. So that, this first line
Which
is
is-
the cost per square foot, and then the second line is the value per square foot. So office, we're getting about 1,200. So when you, basically what I'm taking is I'm subtracting the revenue from the cost to get to this net value number. And in this one, it's negative because once I average in the below market rate units, my average value goes down. And so that's why it's negative here.
Can I
hope that
ask
makes sense.
Sujata though? So this is low income and very low income. Now, if it's the moderate income, does that change that, or it still doesn't change it enough to make it, positive?
We could play around with that, and there might be kind of that break even, that may be the break even place. But I think I was sort of thinking that for rental in this community, based on where you are with your policy, that it would probably require a fair amount of very low and low income. So that was sort of an assumption that I made, because your nexus study is based on very low, and moderate income. So you would have to go through a whole process with HCD if you wanted to make that adjustment.
Other questions about this? I want to make sure folks kind of understand this slide. Dory, do you still have some questions about it, or I just want to make sure we can capture anything that's confusing or not kind of sitting well?
I don't want to waste everyone's time. I'll go over it on my own later.
And we can, maybe.
It doesn't seem to capture the value of office development for developers.
You think the $127 is too low? Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, because that doesn't capture the years of owning and renting it. I mean, it's a funny number to me. Why would anybody develop office for that?
Well, I don't think $127 a square foot is. I mean, I'm not an office developer. I don't know that it seems poor, but I think what you are saying is if somebody owns a building over a lifetime, decades, let's say, maybe they're going to get what's the kind of the lifetime revenue from that, right?
I'm just saying there's more value than appears from that chart.
Yeah, so it could be even higher.
I don't know. It's just.
And I guess maybe Sujata, you could speak to whether or not you model over kind of like a 10-year payback to investors, or I don't know if you get that detailed into your calculations of how you look at the life cycle of a building.
We haven't yet done that type of level of analysis, so the purpose here was really just to show kind of the relative value so that you could kind of understand the relative economics of rental apartments and office. But definitely, they're very different kinds of products. They typically bring very different kinds of investors to the table. There are a lot of assumptions about what kind of office building this would be. Would it be a tech office building? Would it be a smaller office building that's more for local businesses? And all of those components would have very different kinds of results. So we haven't modeled it to that robustly to be able to get into the details. What I really wanted to do with this was just show kind of how the economics of these two different kinds of buildings is how they compare to each other to the extent possible, given very preliminary analysis.
And then Angela, and then we're going to go on to the next part of the presentation.
Sorry, I'll just say really quickly. To me, the simplest way to look at this is, so the total development cost for office is $1,097. You're getting 127 net value. That falls within the range of 12 to 15% return for your cost. And you're right, the market rate value can fluctuate up or down. Sometimes people forget that it can also go down. For instance, if interest rates were to change, then the market value actually goes down, right? Because it's harder to get money to borrow to build the project. So that number can go up and down. So this is where the risk comes into play, is you never really know what that market rate value is going to be in a year, 2 years, 3 years. There could be an economic recession. Things could go backwards. So that's part of the risk of developing a project.
And Angela?
Do the costs at the top of this list include that 15 to 18%, I guess, increase?
They do include some developer fee, but not, I don't think it's that full amount, no.
And then, so the 127 is in addition to the 15 to 18% increase in value, or not? No, it's not. Oh,
No,
okay.
it's not.
It's not in addition to, okay.
So, I mean, that's just, I mean, this is a very, very generalized, I think, what I wanted to do was really just show that there are some margins with a new office development that is a Class A office project that might allow for contribution towards community benefits, and that the economics and feasibility of that would be very different from a rental project that has a lot of BMR units or 15% BMR units, just so you can kind of understand how these different uses, I think sometimes focusing on just one particular land use, you kind of miss the picture of like how a combination of different kinds of development projects can sort of help to mutually achieve all the different objectives that you may have as a community for the North Ventura area.
Great. Okay, thank you. So we're at 7:30. So what I'm going to ask is for Perkins and Will, thank you, Sujata, and she's obviously going to be here for more questions, is to kind of go through the typologies, all of them, and which builds directly on what Sujata has just presented. We'll pause after that for a few questions, and then we'll go through to the rest of it, okay? So please hold your questions unless it's urgent till the end, and it includes me, so I'll be quiet. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sujata. So, as Sujata mentioned, and I think we all have a better understanding, all of these typologies are feasible, of course, with all of these different sort of circumstances of what feasibility really means. A couple things we want to point out. All of these have a greater DU per acre, dwelling unit per acre, than 30, so they're all higher than current zoning. And part of that is to incentivize the developer, which I think is becoming a little more clear. What that also does is increase the yield of units, and it also increases our unit mix. Finally, of these, or a couple more things, of these typologies, only one supports a commercial ground floor, and that's the low-rise block with the kind of red liner that you'll see. However, we do see all of these typologies having active ground floors, which include stoops and lobbies and entrances. So there's really sort of like a social space at the ground floor. Also, we understand that graphically these look maybe like really beautiful Legos. But we just want you to understand this is a massing model, and so these are building envelopes. All of these typologies, rest assured, can support all architectural styles. So we've chosen some precedents to illustrate just that, but we really wanted to make sure that that was clear. So we're going to go through 5 typologies, and each of them will be laid out in the same way. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on the ones up front, and then we'll move a little bit more quickly. So this first typology is the townhome, which I think you're all fairly familiar with. We have some precedents from Emeryville, from Oregon, and from Washington. And what we'll do for each of these models, and here we've sort of tried to show a little bit more articulation and also some of the green space that each of these typologies has built into them. So I'll just walk through 1 through 7, and then for the others, we'll move a little more quickly. But essentially, we talk about massing and articulation. So in this case, there's opportunity for a varied roof line and also for varied facades. There's also a sense of individually articulated units, even though these are attached, and sort of a human scale. The number 3 here is that there'll be unit entries along the street. So there's like front stoops creating a nice neighborhood feel. There's also a planting strip for screening and urban greening. They also have upper level balconies, which all of our precedents have. And then in terms of open space, we call this out for each of the typologies because we know this is really important to everyone. There'll be individual front gardens, and then there's also a shared alley or sort of throughway between the 2 rows of townhomes.
Just want to note, working group members, there's a color in your packet. I see some folks looking at the black and white, which is hard to read. So just in case you want to be able to follow along more easily, look to your left, Doria. There you go. I just want people to have the color. It's harder to read in black and white.
Totally.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. So this section talks about some of those components I just mentioned, and then each of these typologies has sort of the summary metrics. So we'll talk about the stories. In this case, the townhome is 3 stories. The ground floor height across the typologies is 15, and then above it are 10 feet. The total height of the townhomes is around 35 feet. The average unit size of the townhome is 1,500 square feet, and this is something that will vary, as Sujata spoke to, in order to get units that pencil out. Density has to go up, which in some cases doesn't necessarily mean the buildings get higher, but what it does mean is that the unit sizes get smaller. So in this case, the density of the townhome is 33 dwelling units per acre. And across all alternatives, we are assuming a more progressive parking ratio than is currently permitted. We're assuming 1 parking space per unit. Also, I'll mention that all of our parking is underground.
Except for this one.
Except for this one, sorry. Right, townhomes has above ground parking. So for the rest of the typologies, all the parking is underground. The next typology is what we're calling the low-rise greenway. So similarly to the townhome, there's this idea of having varied facade planes, articulation, fenestration, nice use of materials, also entries at the ground floor. What you'll notice here is that we've added a floor and the size of the units have gone down, but what that means is that the density allows us to build to have a smaller building footprint on the same parcel. So the trade-off there is that you get a lot more open space, and so that's what you see in this typology. So not only is there the capacity for individual front gardens and front stoops, but also a greater shared green space. So the next slide will show you a section of that to understand the human scale. And then as I mentioned, this goes up 1 more story, so now we're looking at 4 stories. The ground floor height, as we've said across all typologies, is 15 feet. Above is 10 feet for a total height of 45 feet. The typical unit size is 700 square feet. So that's almost, that's about half of the townhome. And so what that means is that the density goes up, even though you still have a lot of green space, potentially very nice architecture. And so now the density, the dwelling unit per acre is 107. And similarly, in this case, 1 parking space per unit. And in this case, all the parking is underground.
Great. And so now, sort of building off of that low rise with the greenway, this is the low-rise block. So imagine that same general architectural character, but it now wraps around an entire block with a central courtyard open space in the center. This could still be publicly accessible open space. So the way we've modeled it, there's a cut through the building. We see lots of examples of this, but in particular, here are some examples of different 4-story buildings in the images on the right. The idea is that we're finding different ways to incorporate publicly accessible open space, even on a bigger, objectively more bulky building. Additionally, we're, with the 4-story that you see here, with the slightly wider sort of bays of housing, we're able to incorporate green roofs, so accessible green roofs. So now you're starting to see open space that's being incorporated on all different planes, street level and above. A constant, as Rachel mentioned, for all of our alternatives, there are individual ground floor entries along the street. We think this is just sort of an essential component of any really vibrant functional residential neighborhood, is that you're seeing people going in and out of their units, that there's an interaction with people and their ground floor entry and the street. And so we've incorporated into this denser typology as well. Yeah.
I'll also just say these are all examples from Palo Alto that we have pictured here.
Yes. Yes. And so looking at it in section, here's an example of what that interior courtyard might feel like. So it's 110 feet wide. This is prototypical. The dimension could change a little bit depending on the lot size, but the idea is that this is a big enough space that you could program the interior open space in a variety of ways. You could have raised beds for a community garden, you could have a playground, you could have dining space. There's lots of flexibility in that interior space if you keep it available for open space. So again, it's 4 stories. The taller ground floor allows for front stoops, so you could be slightly raised and have sort of a patio that's looking out onto the street. And we're maintaining that same average, the 700 square feet unit size. You'll see that repeating in the next few examples. Parking, again, fully underground. One thing to note, all of these residential prototypes or typologies park themselves. So all the parking that's required, assuming this very progressive 1 space per dwelling unit, that can be contained within this project itself.
Do any of these have guest parking?
There's no guest parking assumed now. Although I will say that there's more parking than is necessary if you sort of maxed out the entire parcel area for some of these typologies. So it's very hypothetical at this point, but we're not assuming it at the moment. All right, so then next typology, this is the low-rise block, but now we've added a ground floor commercial liner. So one side of the building would have ground floor retail. So this could be restaurant, coffee shop. It could be a series. It would probably be several storefronts, ideally. And there could be sort of seating outside of the active ground floor, places for sort of the commercial activity of the interior to spill out into the public realm. In order to make this happen, building off of what Sujata was talking about, how does that ground floor retail get financed? There would likely need to be more residential units put into the building in order to make this all feasible. And so we've added an additional floor of housing to make that work. But other than that, you will see that the massing should look pretty similar. You're still getting your rooftop garden, you're still getting your individual entries, the ground stoop, and you're getting your central courtyard. In section, we can see, again, this looks quite similar, although now you're getting to see how that ground floor retail might play with the street. And so in this example, we've set the ground floor retail back just slightly, so you're getting a little bit wider sidewalk. That could facilitate outdoor dining areas, seating, just spill over from the interior of the store. Again, 2 levels of underground parking, and you'll see that it's only one building that has the retail. The other side would be exclusively multifamily residential. And now with the mid-rise block, this is the taller building. You probably don't see a lot of these in Palo Alto, and the reason we're introducing it here is because it introduces some different trade-offs that we want to have a conversation about with you. So by building up, it might enable us to have sort of a greater mix of unit types. So rather than sticking to that 700 square foot per unit, we might be able to increase that a bit. So there could be more 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, to allow for families of, a variety of family types and household types to occupy this building. Here's an example in section. You can see that the interior open space stays the same. One thing to note is that we are stepping back the building above 6 stories. So along the street, as you're walking, you would perceive a 6-story building as a pedestrian. The upper floors, the 7 and 8, would be further back, and this would allow for more daylight to access the street, and also just as a pedestrian to not feel like a building is sort of falling on top of you, but to have a little bit more space. And so just to kind of summarize, and again, we can talk through more of the details with you in our activity to follow, but we wanted to kind of work through just some of the kind of big picture trade-offs that we're envisioning and we want to kind of work through with you. To start with, all of these typologies, as Rachel said, work for a variety of architectural styles. These are massing models. You can have pitched roofs, you can have craftsmen, you can have anything within this sort of envelope. All of the typologies are incorporating sort of ground floor transparency, basically, between the street and the unit. So front stoops, balconies, a variety of roof lines that are interesting for the pedestrian to see, setbacks that can be landscaped and allow for screening. So we want to kind of soften the edges of these buildings. And all of these buildings also contribute to a vibrant public realm, that these are streets that have buildings that kind of respect the street. So specifically, just going through them real quick, townhomes, we want to hit the point that these really just work for a for-sale model. So they're not going to work for rental. They don't provide on their own any publicly accessible open space in the most traditional form. They do have the alley that's running through that could be a part of a network of bike and pedestrian sort of slow speed connections, but it doesn't have like a contained open space. Moving on to the, yeah.
Just also to say that townhomes don't support ground floor retail, just to understand that that's what differentiates this typology.
Right. With the low-rise greenway, we've increased up to 4 stories, and in exchange, we now have a little bit more usable, publicly accessible open space that is at the street level. So what you're seeing in this diagram is a block. There would be a street that's going along the open space. So the idea that this could be usable open space to not just the people that live in the building, but people in the surrounding neighborhood as well. It works for a for sale or a rental model. And we also see this low-rise greenway as being a potential way to start to transition from existing single-family, more sensitive residential uses up to some of the later multifamily typologies. With the low-rise block, you're getting more publicly accessible open space, but it is a larger building that's going to require a larger parcel size. This is sort of the most common multifamily typology that we're starting to see in Palo Alto or Mountain View along El Camino Real. Like, it might seem familiar to you in that way. So this is something that we have references to and we can see sort of contemporary examples of. When we're adding in the retail, it enlivens the street. It creates an opportunity for a variety of different ground floor retail uses, but it does require an additional floor of residential to make that pencil out. And additionally, these neighborhood-serving commercial typologies need visibility. So there's certain locations where they might be better suited, closer to Portage, closer to El Camino Real, where they're visible, where they can get the sort of foot traffic that they need to sustain their businesses. And then finally, with the mid-rise block, this is a taller, much taller typology, but it comes with an opportunity to think about a more mix of unit types. So units that are potentially bigger and could work for larger families, or just households that have more people in them. And so we're going to pause for questions. Maybe I'll leave it on this. Okay.
So I see Angela's hand, and we'll just kind of go around. We'll maybe try to do 10 minutes of questions, and we'll see if we can use that well. Angela?
I was wondering why only the larger size provides the opportunity for family larger size units. It seems to me that you could, I don't really understand the whole situation, but that even in a 3-story building, if you had a larger unit, it would cost less per unit just because you wouldn't, not less per unit, but it would cost less overall because you wouldn't have to be putting a kitchen and another bathroom in. You would have more floor space with fewer expensive rooms in them. You just have one kitchen for 3 rooms instead of 3 kitchens for 3 rooms. So do you see what I'm saying? I don't understand why you'd have to go with the much taller building in order to have larger units, is my basic question.
Do you want to take it? Well, there's a couple of different factors. So when you build a more compact unit, on a per square foot basis, you get more revenue out of a studio or a 1-bedroom than you do out of a family unit. Or a 3-bedroom. There's more market demand for the smaller units. And so that's kind of a lot of what we see right now. There's also the interplay with the parking standards and parking ratios. So for a smaller unit, you could do 1 space per unit. When you get to 2 or 3 bedroom, that may be more difficult to be able to lease your unit because people might have an expectation of having 2 parking spaces if you have a 2-bedroom unit, or maybe 2 parking spaces for a 3-bedroom unit. So to be able to kind of get the geometry of the site to be the most efficient possible, it works better and you can get more yield out of it if you can get the more compact units, just in terms of the value relative to the cost. Go ahead.
So the price per square foot actually goes down when you have more square feet? The price that you have to pay for them.
Rents don't double from a 1-bedroom to a 2-bedroom, for example, right? So you add a little bit more square footage, but you can't necessarily increase your rents proportionally to the amount of square footage.
But you don't have to put in a kitchen.
The development cost might be a little bit lower on a per square foot basis, but when you add in the parking that you need to be able to provide for a 2-bedroom, because it's hard to lease a 2-bedroom apartment with just 1 space, I would say. Maybe there are other people in the room who would disagree with that, but I think that The expectation in this market, in the Silicon Valley, is that you would either pay less rent if you didn't have a parking space for that second bedroom, or you would look elsewhere where you could get that second parking space.
Or you might look for someplace that had parking per bedroom, the way Tim was mentioning a few months ago.
Right, which I think is our current parking standard in the city.
Right, and so that adds to the cost of building that two-bedroom, because now you have to build 2 parking spaces instead of 1.
I do want to point out, because I think it's important, that it isn't that there aren't any family-sized units in the 4-story building. So it isn't a choice between having family-sized units and not having family-sized units, okay? It's just that there's more of them, I think, numerically speaking, in the 8-story building. And so I think what you'll see if you look at the kind of, there's a little sheet where it has the little number breakdown, kind of like a little baseball card or nutritional facts of the typology or something. It says for most of them, it's average unit size is 700 square feet, but that's averaging together the studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms all together, right? And so then an average size goes up in the 8-story building because you're having more of the larger units. And so again, it's not to say that we can't have family-sized units, and certainly that families live in all types of units. So it's not a total trade-off one or the other, but just kind of more gradation between the two. Alex?
I just have one comment, which is on the low-rise block, like a perimeter block, that there are ways of stepping it down. So like there's one in my neighborhood where it's only 2 stories facing single-family houses, and you can't even see the 4 stories. So I don't want, because I know people are concerned about the height, but there are ways of designing it to fit into the neighborhood. I'll share the examples that I have with the group.
And I just want to mention, really appreciate you saying that, because that segues nicely to when we actually show these typologies in context in the plan area, we're mixing and matching, and that exact kind of transition, the 4-story greenway could work very nicely with a 2-story or 3-story townhome along it, you know, kind of mirroring it in a way. So you're starting to see a stacking. So yes, these are not sort of the be-all, end-all. There can be sort of, things can be mixed together. We would want to see variations in heights, definitely.
Gail?
Thank you very much. So one question, clarification, low-rise block that you're mentioning here. Are you suggesting the economics do not work for retail on the ground floor? Is that what you're saying? In general, but there could be exceptions? I mean, are these kind of generalizations? There are some exceptions.
These are generalizations, and what we're saying is that the low-rise block could have ground floor retail, but it would need more units to make that more feasible. So we've added more units, and that's gone up a floor. But it still stays at the same construction type, so that's what helps keep it comparable to the low-rise block.
Right. And clearly these examples, I mean, frankly, are the lowest level of design, these blocks. So people look at this and just are kind of dismayed because there's, the nuance and design issues are obviously can't be conveyed in these, right? So the other quick question is the parking. Below grade or partially below grade parking is hugely expensive. Is there any rule of thumb regarding, I know that relates to parking ratios and everything else, is there any rule of thumb that would say, okay, if you got rid of all of the underground parking, how would that impact your development costs? In general, I know I'm asking, very general question.
Well, it's significantly less expensive to do podium parking relative to underground parking. You might need to do one level of underground parking in addition to the podium just to get all the parking to fit on the site, depending on which prototype we're talking about. But I don't remember the exact numbers of what we used in our analysis, but let's say an underground parking space costs something like $80,000 per space. I think a podium parking space could be more in the range of $40,000 to $45,000 per space. So you are significantly reducing the amount of cost associated with building the parking.
Just so folks understand, what Gail and Sujata are talking about is if we were building it at grade, so podiums, like again, Plannery's term, architecture term, that some of the parking is at grade would mean it's above ground level.
And one other quick comment, there are examples where they're decoupling parking from the unit. So there are some examples where people can buy a unit without the parking, and there is at least a modest difference in price to the consumer, correct?
Right. So I don't know that there are that many examples in Palo Alto, but I know that they're definitely experimenting with this in neighboring communities, and Mountain View is one where they've worked on unbundling parking, and they charge for the parking separately. I think it's very contextual in terms of, are you providing other transportation options to make it more attractive for those renters?
So, Doria, you'll have the last comment, and I'm going to ask if our consultants will move on with the rest of the presentation.
I just wanted to clarify, on this picture, you're saying that on condo or rental property, people can use the open space, just random people can come there. That seems wildly unrealistic and undesirable if you have housing on the ground floor. People are going to be playing, lying around on their beach towel right outside somebody's house. That seems unrealistic to me, to say the very least. And I did want to mention that according to our housing element, based on the last 2 censuses, the fastest growing household in Palo Alto by far is family housing. And I think when you're talking about family housing, you're talking about 2 parents and children, who knows how many, and you're talking about people that need 2 cars in most cases. I mean, it's very privileged people or older people. The only in Palo Alto, the multifamily housing studies that we did most recently did not recommend reducing parking except in senior housing. Same for subsidized and market rate housing. So I also think it's important to remember that's our fastest growing household, our families with children, per our housing element. And I just find some of these unrealistic. And as to Alex's comment, remember that the step downs are required also currently in our development standards. So.
Thank you, Doria. And if you guys want to continue on, we'll just have to the rest of the presentation.
Yes, this is going to be you.
So very quickly, one of our earlier analyses that we did back in, actually, I think last year, was looking at the retail demand that's associated with new household growth. At that time, we were looking at that 354 household number. So we kind of reconfigured that analysis to look at it more on a per household level to be able to understand how much retail can a new household in this area support. And what we did was we looked at actual data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey for neighborhood serving retail categories. This is sort of partly based on the idea that we're not expecting there to be a new furniture store or some kind of regional kind of big box type of store in this area, just given current retail trends and the changes that are happening in the retail sector. And so we selected the categories mostly, these are groceries, restaurants, drugstores, things of that nature, and some smaller specialized retail. Looked at what the spending is per household, what the estimates of sales per square foot would be for these types of stores, and this is based on looking at comparable types of stores that fit into these categories and what they're reporting in terms of their sales per square foot. To derive kind of how much retail per household could be supported. So for example, at the top line, you see 19 square foot of grocery store per household, 24 square foot of restaurants per household. That's based on kind of Palo Alto spending patterns. So in this community, there's a lot of eating out that's happening, like in many communities. So, this might change depending on which community you're looking at. So overall, we're showing potential for 60 square foot per household, but that really depends on how much of that spending is captured internally to North Ventura. So many people don't do all of their shopping and eating in their neighborhood. Many people will go somewhere close to their work or will go somewhere else in another community. The bottom lines here are just showing If you were to capture 25% of these sales, that would be 15 square feet per household. If you were to capture 50%, that would be 30 square feet. And if you were to capture 75% internal, that would be 45 square feet. And a lot of this also depends on the types of retail tenants you're able to get internal to the site, where you put the retail, how you create the environment that will encourage that spending.
Great. And so another type of sort of community benefit that we think of in a vibrant that we envision in a vibrant neighborhood is obviously open space. And so just going to start off with our goals and assumptions. We're using the comprehensive plan, of course, with the open space goal of 2 acres per 1,000 residents. So this is baseline, as is the parkland dedication ordinance, which requires 366 square feet of open space per unit. All of the alternatives that you'll see meet these standards, and some exceed. Just to be clear, the creek easement, we know there's this ongoing creek study. In whatever sort of form that the creek restoration takes, that will be wonderful, and that could approximate about 1.4 acres of some sort of creek restoration open space. That area is not included in our open space calculations, so that would be additional later. But for now, imagine everything beyond the creek, because we wanted to be clear with you sort of what the NV cap area, what kind of open space it can sustain just on its own without the creek. And so we have 3 sort of categories of open space that we're introducing. The first is centralized. I promise it's a coincidence that we actually have an image of South Park that Alex mentioned on the left. So this is your more sort of traditional open space, right? It's larger contiguous spaces. It's not tied to any housing typology. It's standalone. We then have greenways, which these are non-vehicular connections that run, of course, all through the plan area. And so these could be sort of social spaces for people to gather, but it's also places for active recreation, jogging, biking. And then we have your courtyards, green roofs. So these are open spaces that are attached to a residential or commercial typology, and they could be publicly accessible. They don't have to be, but we wanted to throw out the option to you that this is another way of leveraging open space from commercial development. And so here you can see very tiny, I promise they are bigger on the activity that we have for you later, but here's how the open spaces sort of array themselves in the 3 alternatives. And so we have some calculations running along each. Basically, if you combine all of these different open space types, you're getting between 6.7 acres of open space in the first alternative to nearly 13 acres in the final alternative. If you wanted to be really particular and just think about the centralized open space, we're getting between nearly 3 acres in alternative 1 and just over, close to 3.5 or just over around 3.5 for alternative 2 and 3. So you can see there starts to be more opportunity for open space as new development sites come online.
All 3 of these, you're counting the interiors of these buildings to take full blocks of open space, correct?
So the first number, the 6.7, 12.3, 12.8, that includes the interior, the courtyards and the green roofs. If you just wanted to think about sort of park, so what we're calling centralized open space, that's the 2.9, 3.5, and 3.3 acres for each. Yeah. So hopefully this slide looks a little bit familiar to you all. Back in the spring, we asked you to tell us about your favorite neighborhoods, your most vibrant neighborhoods that you've been to. And these neighborhoods yield a variety of metrics. And so in taking sort of the population density, the jobs density, the retail and service density of these places, and creating sort of a composite, sort of vibrant neighborhood target, we can start to see how these neighborhoods compare to our neighborhood. So this is existing NV cap area. We have these, so the map in the upper right kind of shows the catchment area that we're looking at. This does include part of Cal Ave, which was included for census reasons, so it's a little bit aggregated. But what we're showing in the bottom circles is population density of the NV cap area is dark green. The target, so sort of the desired population carrying capacity of a vibrant neighborhood is the dotted gray line. And so you can see our population density is quite a bit smaller than the carrying capacity of some of these other neighborhoods, like downtown Palo Alto, like Emeryville, like Central Square in Cambridge. Jobs density, we're above the target. That should be very obvious to all of us. We talk about this a lot, that there's a jobs housing imbalance, and our neighborhood is very much like reflecting that. And then finally, with retail and services, we're sort of right at the sweet spot, but then we remember that this is including Cal Ave. So we have 84 service and retail businesses is the target. We're at 80 service and retail businesses per square mile if you include Cal Ave. So we do need to think about how NVCAP might want to introduce more retail, given that we're looking to increase the population here and have more people living here.
So building off of what Annie just said, we wanted to sort of get a snapshot of the existing conditions within NVCAP, because as we move through the alternatives, we're going to be discussing proposed versus full build out. So to understand what's there now, within the NVCAP plan area, there's 120 housing units, about 560,000 gross square feet of Class A office, 150,000 feet of retail, and about 2,400 parking spaces. So now I'm just going to read through some criteria for each of the alternatives. So remember, this is going to be moving across all of them. First, there will be additional proposed office square footage in the alternatives. However, as we've discussed tonight, this is in part due to looking at how that office can partially potentially subsidize community benefits. Also, we have kept the additional office within existing footprints, so that's a strategy that we discussed last working group, and we've carried it forward. Current retail at the site is not right-sized for the population, so there's actually, based on the analysis Sujata did and sort of understanding current population, when Fry's was still there was more retail than the population within NVCAP could actually support. So some of our alternatives are going to show a reduction. Just to be clear, we can talk about that when we get there. The new jobs calculation is based on the proposed office and retail program, not on what is there plus our proposed. Again, we can clarify as we move through the alternatives. The location of housing typologies considers proximity to transit and is sensitive to the extent possible to surrounding uses. So, one thing we're really trying to push with this project is being more progressive with the parking ratio very much has to do with our location, and we are close to Caltrain. So that's something we're really considering. The alternatives, as Annie has already spoken to, the alternatives open space calculation includes all three categories, but we also have a further breakdown that shows on a more granular level, how much centralized open space versus greenways. All new construction, as we've already mentioned, is self-parked. And in all of the alternatives, you'll see one of the trade-offs of keeping the Fry's building, for example, is that we can't put underground parking under the existing building. So when we build on the surface parking lot that is there today, we move those parking spaces to a district parking garage. So accommodation for additional program will be found in the district parking garage that you see in all of the four alternatives. So the first alternative actually has two parts. It's alternative 1A and 1B, the main difference being whether or not the Cloudera parcel comes online. So quickly, I'll just lay out how these sort of read. This will be the same for all the alternatives. In the bold, you have our proposed program, and then in the italics beneath that, you have the final build out. So for the first alternative 1A, we're proposing 952 units, an additional 47,000 feet of office. To be clear, this office is not additional built space, but it's a redistribution of the program that's occurring in the 340 Portage building. So formerly there was about 90,000 feet of retail. 30,000 will be kept for retail, and the remainder, which is about the difference, which is 47,000 square feet, would be office. Retail is adding 23,000 square feet, and open space, again, this includes all three categories, is about 6.7 acres. So really quickly, the Fry's building remains, as you see. The use is redistributed, which is what you see between blue, which is office, and red, which is retail. There would be 100 new units on the 340 Portage parcel, which you see adjacent to Matadero Creek. The office building on Ash, which is currently office, will be given over to a community use. And our height is primarily concentrated along El Camino Real. The open space, this will also be consistent across all alternatives, is about 2.4 acres, and that is on the 340 Portage parcel. And the new jobs to housing ratio, which we will also track for all the alternatives, for the final build out is 2.2. So you can see that there's a reduction in what is there currently, which is about 9.5. The trade-offs, which I'll move through quickly, keeping the Fry's building does limit the overall housing yield. However, permitting housing to develop at a higher density, which is about 100 dwelling units per acre, does incentivize the developer to provide open space, 2.4 acres, and a community use at the current office building on Ash. There's more details, but we'll leave those for everyone to go through at a later time. The next alternative is 1B. So everything is the same as 1A except for Cloudera. The Cloudera parcel has come online. And what that has meant is 628 new multifamily units on the Cloudera parcel. You will notice there's one 85-foot building, which is the orange building on the corner of Page Mill and Ash. We located it there because it's within proximity of Caltrain, and there was a lot of sentiment about not having it on Park Boulevard, so we sort of considered that location based on conversation we've had. As we've talked a lot about this evening, one of the trade-offs, one of the ways to sort of incentivize this is to add some office square footage. So although it's within the same building footprint as you see today, we are assuming that the office increases by about 60,000 square feet. Oh, and just quickly to go over the numbers. So proposed program is about 1,500 units, multifamily units. Office, you're seeing an increase of about 107,000 square feet. This is across both the Cloudera and the 340 Portage site. Retail remains the same as 1A, and the open space increases because what you're seeing within the Cloudera parcel is that some of these typologies, as we've discussed, allow for more shared open space.
And a public.
And what would be sort of a public open space on the corner of Ash and Olive.
And then if you guys can maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes for the next few, I don't want to rush you, but I do want to make sure we have some time for conversation before we have to wrap up the meeting.
Yep. I think I've actually covered everything, so I'll have Annie move on to the final two.
Great. So if you watch the slide, you will see the transition. We've basically taken the same sites, so now the Cloudera site is involved as well as 340 Portage and the other sites you saw before, but rather than have a type 3 building, so the 85-foot, we've sort of evened out the housing heights around, and you see more of the low-rise block. On the 340 Portage site, you're seeing this partial removal of Fry's. This, of course, is something that we need to continue to have conversations about, the feasibility of it. But what we wanted to play out was a potential scenario where a portion, the historic portion of the building, the monitor roof, is maybe isolated as some sort of kind of experiential retail space. So the remaining part of 340 Portage stays as office, but then that portion of the building gets reclaimed through some really exciting adaptive reuse, and it becomes this sort of centerpiece hallmark of the neighborhood. In order to incentivize that, we're putting in sort of a target of 60,000 square feet of additional office space that could be introduced to the 340 Portage parcel. These are sort of placeholder numbers in some ways because there are so many moving parts, but we wanted to introduce the concept to you all and have a discussion about this. So there is an additional increase of office in this alternative beyond what you saw in alternative 1B. There is no change at Cloudera in terms of office, so that office stays the same. And I've explained that the housing has gone down, so there are slightly fewer units at the Cloudera site. And so overall, we're seeing about 1,700 units yielded in the plan area, 167,000 square feet of office, a little bit more retail. So the thinking is that as we're increasing the population, there's now a bit more of a carrying capacity that can support that retail, and we're being very intentional about where it's locating along Portage to try to really activate that Portage spine. And then open space has increased to 12.3 acres. And I think all of these trade-offs we've pretty much covered. I will just note that partial removal of Fry's, in addition to being an opportunity to kind of think about a creative adaptive reuse project, it also offers new connectivity through the site. So right now we have this very monolith building that really cuts down on cross neighborhood circulation for pedestrians and bikes, and this offers a new opportunity to kind of rethink that. And then finally, alternative 3. This is the sort of fullest build out that we are showing. You can see just about every site is somehow touched, aside from the existing single family residential, which you probably have noted in all of our alternatives is sort of dashed, outlined. The idea there is that could be sort of a potential site for future upzoning, but we've heard from you all that the idea of kind of keeping the existing residential character of that neighborhood is very important, and so it's been sort of outlined in that way. So in addition, the kind of, I think the key point of this alternative is, of course, that the entire Fry's building is now removed in order to incentivize that, in order for it to be to give the developer an appetite for basically removing an existing building that's commanding good office rents. We're increasing the amount, we're showing an increased amount of office on the 340 Portage parcel. But to be clear, all office that's shown in this alternative exists within the existing office footprint of the plan area today. So anywhere where you see that sort of purplish blue office color, it's sitting within a location that already has office today. In addition, we're seeing sort of the overall most amount of housing units. And just like I explained in the last alternative, the idea is with bringing these people online, that enables us to add a significant amount of more retail. So now we have sort of a full retail spine running along Portage. And all of the properties along El Camino Real that are currently zoned for retail could continue to have that ground floor retail with some housing above it. And I think we can probably move on. Maybe I'll leave it on this.
Yeah, so we're at 8:20. Typically, we would be heading into public comment now. We did start a little bit late, so I do wonder if our working group members, I know it's getting late, I'm getting a little tired, but if maybe we can indulge ending a little bit after 8:30, just so we can have a little bit of conversation. We know we'll have to pick this up and have further conversation. There's no way we're gonna, have the full tonight, but we'll have a little bit, and then we'll get our heads together to see how we can make sure we have more space for more conversation. If that sounds okay to everyone? Seeing no objections, we'll give ourselves a little bit more time. We'll try to get out of here at 8:40. So do you guys want to lead a little bit of discussion or hear from the working group members, and then we'll head to public comment? That sounds
good.
Sounds good?
Yeah.
Do you want folks just to raise comments, or do you want to propose some questions for people? How would you like to get the feedback on the proposals?
Yeah, we actually put some questions together, and maybe, so do you think 10 minutes or? Yeah. Maybe we'll start with asking the working group members to speak to which of the alternatives matches their vision for the NVCAP area, and maybe give some examples about either housing or ground floor use, office or open space, which are kind of the 4 elements we talked about. Give some examples for how the plan either matches those or where it could use improvement.
Why don't we first go on where we're seeing some resonance with your vision, and then we'll go to places where that can be improved. So if people have either, whether it's a specific alternative or maybe it's the same aspect of an alternative, like, oh, this particular part around the creek I really like in all 3, let's hear what's resonating, and then we'll go once folks have spoken to what is not resonating with their vision. And so I want to make sure everyone also has a chance to speak on this. So who would like to start? What's resonating with your vision that we kind of had in our beginning session? What?
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question first? So the methodology, it sounds like on 340 Portage is beef up the office there so multifamily can be built elsewhere. What about the same methodology on other parts of the NVCAP area? For instance, if you look at Portage, so going Portage from El Camino through the site, right now most of that is office. So for instance, you go up to Portage and Ash, right there, a lot of that's becoming just strictly multifamily, but it's replacing probably 50,000 square feet of office. So I think the same economic kind of weight needs to be taken to that is, are they realistically going to redevelop that and get rid of the office to do the apartments? Kind of comes down to the land question we came to before. If you're taking an empty piece of land, maybe it's 100,000 per unit. If you're taking an office building, converting it into apartments, that's maybe 300,000 per unit or 200,000 per unit. So it's just not realistically going to happen if the office isn't taken into account in those areas.
That's good feedback. Okay, other folks? Good.
So, we've been talking about this in terms of, it was mentioned earlier, 354 units, I think, in the NVCAP. And we have examples here that range from 900, or basically, to 2,700. That is so far from what we have been talking about. I was shocked when I read this. And I think it's important. I looked up a few facts in our comp plan in the housing element, and this is equivalent of putting basically 10 in the highest build out, alternative 3, 10% practically of our existing population into the Ventura area, and it would represent, if Palo Alto is about 26 square miles and 1/3 is open space, we can assume it's 18 square miles. That would be putting 10% of the current population into 0.5% into this little tiny area. I mean, I was shocked. It would have densities equivalent of 18 times denser than what we are today, and all concentrated in one area, and that's the density of Manhattan, which is the most dense county in the United States of America. This so far exceeds what the parameters that we were thinking about this in, that I just don't even know where to begin. There's lots of mistakes and assumptions in all of this.
So I just want to clarify what you're saying is you don't like the density. You think it's more dense than you would prefer.
No,
and
we were talking about.
Well, I want to understand that. What I want to also clarify, and I'm not trying to cut you off, but I want to make sure we have space for everybody to talk about their thoughts on it. And I want to make sure I'm capturing what you're saying. So we're saying too many units. I do want to say what we've said is that the housing element says there's 354 units. We can't go below that. I am sorry if there was an assertion or belief that was the amount of units we were trying to accommodate. That is the amount of units that are currently zoned in the plan area. So the idea that would be the same, I'm sorry if that became somehow a misconception that we were saying we were going to present plans with 354 units.
Well, I sort of assumed, and I think probably a lot of other people in Palo Alto might, since that's what's in the housing element, that would be at least a starting ground. This so far exceeds it, and it's so outside of anything that we have talked about. I just don't think it bears. I don't think most of these bear any resemblance to reality. And to Len's points, you're making a lot of assumptions, and a lot of the terms I think are used in a very strange way. But I'll leave it at that so other people can think about it.
Great, thanks, Tim.
I'm thinking in trying to put these alternatives out for people to understand. I think it'd be helpful to appreciate what it would need to be changed in the general plan and zoning guidelines to effectuate this. What would be necessary to effectuate the ownership, since this doesn't follow any particular ownership. As an example, this model doesn't follow that. What would be needed to be removed to be able to implement this as far as existing buildings and listing some of those things. And a thing that kind of interesting is that the Mike's Bike site that I just talked about has been totally unentitled and re-entitled for something more intense than I have in entitlements in all of the models and that are being reflected here. Because I have 44 total residential units, and I don't think any of these alternatives reflect that on that site. And then the last question, the yellow is suggesting what height, and the new office building is reflecting what new height?
So the yellow, that is kind of the golden rod. It's not really
Yeah.
golden rod. It's kind of a neon. I'm not sure what shade it would be. I believe that is where there's not retail, it's 4 stories. Where there's retail, it's 5 stories. And then the office height, I'm not sure for the Cloudera or for the three-quarter board.
6 stories.
Okay, on both sites.
So it's for purple variation. This is 4.
Which would,
So it ranges from 3 up to 6 stories, depending. Like you can see, there's some variation, but it would be.
which would not be allowed under the current designation.
That's right.
So that's the kind of point I'm suggesting is in the footer, in the legend somewhere, you need to say this, and this would have to change. These actions would have to be in place that is different from today across the whole city. The parking ratios would have to change as an item, the expectation for height, the change in ownership. Each of these would have to, I think, be helpful to understand the
Yeah.
pros and cons of each or the actions that would have to be necessary. One shows a property with a garage, new parking garage built on it that isn't owned by the properties that you're suggesting are going to be redeveloped. And so those kinds of things to me suggest that the continuity and the opportunities here are harder to think you can achieve, and we need to be clear on what those challenges are to the decision makers.
That's great feedback. Why don't we just go in a circle and everyone can give their thoughts, and then we'll go to public comment. I think that might be the right way to go. So we'll go this way, and then Lakiba, and then Gail will be last, because we'll go around here this way. Okay. Angela?
Yeah, I have spent a lot of time talking to my neighbors about the whole NVCAP area, and I find myself there. Mostly people are really worried about higher density and more people, and I have reassured them, well, don't worry. We probably won't go much above 30 units per acre because that's what the zoning is. And it's not quite clear to me why we would go so far above the 30 units per acre and make it so much more dense. I don't understand that, and I'm really surprised that we would try to squeeze so many more units into this small area. I'm just really surprised, and I don't know how I would explain it to my neighbors. I will say, to respond in a positive way, to I like that the small old white and green building is kept in each of the alternatives. I like that building a lot. And I'm a little confused about what you guys mean about when you say community, because I'm not sure what would attract people to the areas that are pink. I mean, maybe they could be used as meeting places, but there's an awful lot of meeting place there. Whereas I think that maybe I'm not sure how community pays for itself either. But retail perhaps might attract people to go there and hang out there and be there. So that's my thought about the community. That's about it.
Thank you, Angela. Alex?
Rachel,
Sorry.
can I just take 1 minute?
Yes, we are running out of minutes, but you may use the
30
minutes.
seconds. Yeah, Tim, Angela, you both spoke about it. I think the whole premise here for the city to engage us was not necessarily to look at what is possible with the current regulations in place, but to really look at the potential and really imagine the future that we want for this place. So yes, we have kind of given ourselves the opportunity to think higher, denser than what the zoning currently allows.
I think my point was, I'm not challenging that part, but there's nothing here that suggests to them as policymakers what they have to change in the policy to implement what you're showing them.
Yeah. What's the lift? That's great.
And regardless of opportunities, my neighbors would be really shocked and upset to hear the densities.
Understood. Alex?
I think my overall thought is that I think I'd like to see like more, how do we call it, more like definition and character on the different streets. So like Lambert, I think should be different than Portage and Olive, and I guess I'm thinking like next step, and I'm not sure where, yeah. And then also, I think I'm concerned also about the we call it like the lateral connection between NVCAP and California Avenue, and I'm not quite seeing it in the 3 different schemes yet, especially in the scheme 1A and 1B.
Thank you, Alex. Heather?
I'm just going to second everything that's been said about the density and just move on from that. On a positive note, will say that I liked the commitment to open space and calling it out, and I thought that that was good to see. I wish there was a little bit more connectedness of it in the different models, and I also would appreciate seeing a little bit more of sort of the nuance of what the feasibility options are with each category and what specific problems could arise within each one, because it's sort of hard to look at and actually evaluate it without understanding all of those nuances. So I think that would be a little bit more helpful. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Can I clarify when you say that, you're talking kind of about Sujata's presentation regarding the financial feasibility, or was it a different aspect of the feasibility that you were referring to?
No, so like talking about the different height restrictions and what would actually be possible in each of these, what would need to happen to make this actually
For
work
each scenario, for each total scenario. Okay, the Tim's
and for
point.
each
Got it.
building, yeah.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you. Makiba?
So, ditto about the density. I thought it was interesting, but I understand that you asked what we liked first and then get to the other. So I couldn't identify exactly what I liked. But besides the density per se, it looks like on alternative 3, I keep trying to look at the colors there, but it looks like my house is gone. So that might be something I would be concerned about.
I don't think that we've changed any of the single-family homes on
There's
that
like a
street. What that
white
should
space.
The white is the house in this instance, and the yellow is the backyard, I believe, is the coloration on this.
Did you take away my backyard?
No, it's just shaded yellow to show that it's the single-family home. I'm not sure why the coloration changed, but... Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, sorry. I was like, I think I see what you're saying now that I'm looking very, very close at it. So that is a problem.
Yes.
Thank you. And Gail?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I liked all of the alternatives for in different ways. I think I'm very partial to the one that provides the greatest opportunities for diversity of housing types and for the number of housing types, and that's clearly alternative number 3. And I recognize at this stage, these are conceptual ideas. I would agree with comments made earlier about the character of the streets and some of the design implications there, because you don't want to go down one street and then move to the next street and not realize you've changed streets. I mean, there has to be a significant change in paving materials or landscaping or design or building materials to make a huge difference. I think the other thing in my mind is that I always say this, and I guess people are used to it by this point, is that we're looking at this in the context of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think it would be helpful to have a feeling for what are some of the numbers that are anticipated for Palo Alto in general over the next 20 years. And it's not going to be at the population we are at now. And I guess the thing that keeps driving and informs me is we have a significant housing crisis for all across the spectrum. Housing types, housing design, housing location, cost, rental. Our children, our grandchildren are moving away. Seniors are moving if they can't afford a place here. And I think that's a real driver for me in terms of this particular area, in my view, presents opportunities that are significant. And I think this can be done very beautifully and with some sensitivity. The other thing that I liked very much was the fact that I guess, do I have the right terminology, the open space? By being more compact, you have more open space for community, for active and passive recreation, for public health, all of those issues. And the community benefits that can be yielded from this are significant. And my view, I'm going longer than I should, is that the community benefits don't just benefit the people immediately here, they benefit the people immediately and adjacent. So all of the current people who live here and work here would have great, great opportunities. The last quick point is the zoning and the development standards and all of these issues. Yes, you've said repeatedly that there has to be modification to make this come to fruition. Well, comprehensive area plans can develop those details to make it feasible. So that's where I am. I think that there are some very creative ideas here. And this also is an area that'll be phased. It's not like it's going to turn like that. So those are my views. And I think, again, I'll end with we have a significant housing crisis. And this is an opportunity to develop needed housing of different sizes, et cetera. So that's my thought.
I turned my microphone off instead of on. So we're going to move into our public comment period, and what I will do is meet with our co-chairs to think about ways we can make sure we have some opportunities for feedback on this in addition to our community workshop, because I know that our consultants want to refine the product for that, and so we need to just figure out how we're going to do that. So we'll put our heads together and make sure we have a plan to deal with that. Can you call the public speakers?
Next public speaker, David Adams.
And if anyone wants to speak, if you can please give your card to Chitra so we can know who's speaking. You'll have 3 minutes, and there will be a timer that goes off when your time is up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Mr. Steele for his presentation. Very useful. We live on Olive, and we'll certainly be popping around the corner to visit that shop. I know we're a small sample, but just wanted to provide some encouragement on that space, as well as any other retail that you can put in that space as well. Regarding the Mike's Bikes space, with that, the development of that site being indeterminate, I'm wondering whether you could put retail in that space as well, because it seems to have been empty for a couple of years now. Mike's Bikes moved out. They've moved to an inferior location in my mind, and you know, it must be a reasonable location for retail because you're considering it in the new development as well. Regarding the alternatives, I don't know, what can I say? This doesn't seem to have been considered with any boundary conditions or any existing conditions. It looks like the Agilent building is being demolished and rebuilt. Demolish, rebuild the AT&T Xfinity building on the corner. I was also going to mention the demolition of Lakiba's house, but I couldn't say it any better than she did. But I think the community would not want anything like this, and I think it's been done with a total lack of sensitivity to the community. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mark Molinax.
Hi there. My name is Mark Molyneux. I'm a renter over on Seal. One thing I'd like to comment first is I see the breakdown of community benefits, talk about the affordable housing we can produce and how there's a community benefit. That's good. We certainly have decades-long backup. Our queues are ridiculous for affordable housing. We need to do as much as we can to fix this. I would just like to say that on top of this, I would say that the rental units we can produce themselves are a community benefit. We are going to be producing places for renters to live, and that's a community benefit. And I guess I would like to introduce something to think about, which is we talk about rental opportunities, ownership opportunities. Let's talk about the two different types of people who enter in this. If you're a renter, you feel how difficult it is to live here. It is something that you are aware of, you pay on an ongoing basis. If you are an owner, you're an investor. You're investing in real estate. And in fact, this first is going to produce a different type of person, one who has more money to invest. And secondly, it's one who does not consider affordability to be a problem because you're locked in. So I would say renters are a community benefit. I would say owners are a community disbenefit. To look at that, I would like to push back on how people were offended with the amount of density we're seeing here. I would say this actually is a symptom of the fact that when people are homeowners and don't viscerally feel the unaffordability around us, just aesthetic details such as this is way too dense become something more meaningful than the need for us all to take on the burden of a changing community. The idea that people, when they come here, they need 2 cars is something, as Commissioner Suma said earlier. I would say, well, one, at this density, looking at moving much below 1 car per unit. At this density, this is the type of density people actually can use transit. It's a great opportunity. As it was mentioned, this would be 10% of the people in Palo Alto in this area. This is absurd. I agree it's absurd, but this is an indication of larger problems, such as the absurdly low density considering price throughout the rest of Palo Alto. I think that that's beyond the scope of this to change the density elsewhere. And of course, the amount of price per unit is tremendously high, and that's really out of scope too. We'd like to bring construction costs down, but there are industrial level problems with why construction is so high. So I would just say I enthusiastically support the amount of density. I'd like to see it as high as possible. And I'd say Palo Alto needs to change. We need to figure out how we adjust to it. And I think just saying this is too dense, please don't change, is not a realistic response to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Next speaker, Karen Holman.
Hi again. Appreciate the presentations actually by Angela and by Tim very much. To Lun's point, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's a very practical point, and I'm not sure that what's been presented is, I hate to be just a critic, I mean, I really do, but I don't know that what's been presented is practical in pretty much any form or fashion. I mentioned earlier that the densities and heights are going to be a shock to people. and I don't think palatable. I also want to point out something very critical to this is all of the jobs growth assumes 4 employees per 1,000 square feet, and that is so long gone. I mean, when we did SOFA, I did, a survey of the SOFA area, just informal on my own. It was 8 per 1,000 then. If you go by any office now, it's like, so if you look at what the housing advantage is over some of these proposals, it's very unrealistic. There's no 4 per 1,000 office in the city unless it's, maybe in a high-end attorney's office. That's probably about it. So that needs to be made more rational. Retail, it says that, we can't support as much retail because it's neighborhood retail. Well, this is a site where people are accustomed to going, and I think from my perspective, if there was really an economic analysis done and a feasibility study of the cannery building and with the owners to see what could go in there. I mean, Target, for instance, a Target mini store, that's not neighborhood serving. It's going to be a magnet. So, and that's okay, but to reduce the retail because the neighborhood itself couldn't support it is, I think, selling short what is possible there. The parking garage on the El Camino end of the cannery building, I think, is odd planning, especially as I think Lund said that nobody owns that's looking to redevelop. What's missing overall in this is, again, what I mentioned last meeting is placemaking. Placemaking was given one-word mention at the last meeting, but there was no discussion of placemaking. I see no placemaking, and I see no consideration for the cultural amenities and cultural uses that this working group and the public have spoken about many, many, many times. As to housing types, I would really like to see the introduction of some co-housing, which is used in other communities and very successfully and addresses some of the affordability issues. And last, the design standards. Well, 2 things. There need to be design standards and considerations for transition and displacement. And there was one other thing which I didn't make a note of, which is escaping me at the moment. But anyway, thank you very much. I look forward to the next time not being such a critic.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker.
Next speaker, Kelsey Benz.
Thank you again. I know I already spoke earlier about the need for density at this site, but I didn't really talk about why, and I think that is maybe the more important piece. So I will say in my professional capacity, I have spent the past several years as a psychologist working with homeless veterans. And I will say, when you hear on a daily basis stories of people getting priced out of their homes and getting pushed into more and more desperate living situations, the urgency of this crisis that we are in becomes very salient. And then in my own personal experiences, I have had to move every year that I have rented in Palo Alto. Most recently, my rent went up 18%, and I am no longer a renter because I am now living with my partner's family. Because I have left my work as a psychologist to do housing advocacy this year, I would otherwise not be able to be in Palo Alto. So I think as we're thinking about how to explain this to your neighbors, and I do empathize with that problem, because if you say to someone, I want your neighborhood to change in this dramatic fashion, it's going to cause anxiety. So like I feel that concern, but I think what needs to happen is you can empathize with that anxiety and then bring it back to our values as a community and why this is important. So we want to have an inclusive community. We want to have different ages of people able to be part of our community and serving our community. Among my peers who are getting priced out of the community, they're psychologists, We're reasonably high-paid professionals, but we're not high-paid to the same level of tech. But if you want to have psychologists to serve this community, primary care physicians, nurses, all of those professionals, we're not going to get BMR housing, but we need to be included as you're thinking about the future of this community. And that is the why that I think is really important, and this committee needs to remember and think about how to communicate that to your neighbors, but that's why we need more density, is so we can include more kinds of people in the future of our city. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Eugene L.
Hi there. I'm a Olive Avenue person. And I just wanted to note that in all of these developments, Olive Avenue and Pepper Street are quite neglected, and these houses are, I don't know how old they are, about 80 years old or so, and they're still standing. Sustainability is another aspect that we need to remember. We talked about all of this affordable housing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against any affordable housing thing, but I want to just note that when you get to affordable cost of manufacturing, the quality of the construction is going to drop too quite a bit. And we want to make sure that whatever we build isn't just going to get knocked down in another 20 years to make it look more beautiful again. So from sustainability, we need to make sure that we don't just make cheap houses. We want to make sure it's a community that actually is going to last, like Ventura and Olive and Pepper Street in particular. I mean, these houses are what Ventura is. It just happens to be bisected by body shops. We've got a massive cannery because of the railroad easement. That whole parking lot is zigzag because it was a train yard, and this was housing to support that. So that's the history of the neighborhood that we need to also appreciate. I think going way too big with these developments is just going to make these massive towers. My backyard is, I'm happy to see it's now a 2-story instead of behind us, instead of a 3-story looming down, looking in our backyards. So having these tall structures, 5 stories is kind of absurd from the standpoint of this tiny little street with 1 story. We're zoned for R1. We can't even do anything except just make McMansion houses. And these houses are old. They're all falling apart. There's termites galore in all of them. So we need to make sure that they're appreciated with the neighbors that are going to suddenly consume us. But most of all, traffic is the last thing. Olive Avenue is a racetrack. Cars are blazing down there 40, 50, 60 miles an hour and blowing the stop sign like it doesn't exist. And in both directions. It's not just one way. They're going up to El Camino because they're circumnavigating Page Mill and El Camino. That intersection is jammed up morning and evening, and it's everybody's going everywhere possible to get around that, which includes Olive Avenue, among things. And I know Pepper has definitely a huge cut through going in the morning commute. So please look at the traffic patterns, in particular what exists, not to mention when you add how many thousands more people, and they will have cars because they're not all going to live and work within 2 blocks of where they work. They probably still going to work across town, and the public transit doesn't work well enough yet to support that. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So before we head out, if folks have not submitted their worksheet to Angela, and I believe you have everybody's, okay, and members of the public were invited also to submit or put theirs in if they wanted, and with your name or without your name. So we're going to conclude this meeting. Our next community meeting is on February 27th, and we will work to figure out how to get some feedback in between then. Thank you all very much.